What are the best Cormac McCarthy novels of all time? And today I am going to rank McCarthy's works not only against himself and his bibliography, but against the canon, against all the greats, the Tolstoys, the Dostoevskys, the Melvilles, the Faulkners, the King James Bibles. All of that is going to happen in today's episode and more. And my name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we cover Cormac McCarthy. In the playlist down below, you will find over 200 videos on McCarthy's books, life, and philosophy towards so many different things, which makes it the greatest deep dive into any author in the history of the internet. I have read all of McCarthy's novels at least 5 times, some of them over 10 times. One of them over 15 times. And today, we aren't just going to rank the novels. We are going to rank the screenplays, the unpublished screenplays, the plays, the short stories, the poems, all of it and more. And so this is the definitive guide to the strengths and weaknesses of every McCarthy novel, because I've read every secondary article about McCarthy, all the scholarly interpretations. I've been online reading about McCarthy for 14 years now. I know how everyone else feels, and I'm going to hopefully bring it all together into the best ranking that I can give to you guys. And so, if you guys want to support me and the literary renaissance, the movement that is happening right now that is going to reignite the world's interest in literature, be sure to subscribe to this channel. And if you don't like me for whatever reason, go support another booktuber, go support another modern author, because we need all the support that we can get if we are going to make this happen. And so, where do we start? And of course, we have to start with none other than Blood Meridian. Well, unfortunately for so many of my Blood Meridian bros out there, Blood Meridian, contrary to what you have heard, is not Cormac McCarthy's best novel. And I say that coming from the point of view that this novel is a masterpiece. This is one of the greatest American novels ever written. This is one of the greatest Westerns ever written. But as you are going to hear in this presentation, there are 2 other novels that are better. So what first and foremost makes this a masterclass is that it is the first time really in American literary history where someone, or I should say an author, brought the Southwest to life. When I look at so many other Western novels, we could be talking about Larry McMurtry or Butcher's Crossing, or all these novels, some of which take place in like the actual Southwest, others take place more like in the Midwest. Their prose most of the time is flat. And McCarthy, first and foremost, is a stylist. He is someone who focuses on sentences. You know, there has been, I should say, recently in the past couple decades, this obsession stemming from MFA programs with the sentence and like revising sentences and focusing on sentence structure. And sometimes that can really weigh a text down, especially when it's coming from like an acolyte writer from academia. But with McCarthy, his style lights this world on fire. He enlivens the Southwest in such a beautiful way. And I grew up in the Southwest. I write desert poetry. My first poetry collection is going to be titled Desert Orpheus. And so watching McCarthy do this blew my mind, because I've read all the desert poetry. I've read the desert literature, whether that's in America or somewhere else in the world, whether that's in Spain or the Middle East, Argentina, and all the literature coming out of there. And McCarthy did it better than all of them. And the setting of Blood Meridian, the desert, is bleak. But the thing about having a bleak landscape is that you can paint over it. The desert is known for creating hallucinatory experiences, mirages, but it also is home to a very shamanic culture. If you look at the Yaqui Indians, who are one of the more ancestral tribes that weren't raiders like the Comanches or the Apaches coming, migrating from the north, they had a very shamanic culture, that people like Carlos Castaneda wrote about. And so McCarthy does a perfect job tapping into that liminal space of the desert night. When you look at the history of mysticism in the West, with the Abrahamic religions manifesting in the desert with, the Hebrew God, then Jesus, then Muhammad, with all the Christian saints that went out to the desert for, centuries, if not millennia after Jesus. Desert mysticism is huge. And because much of the Wild West took place in the desert. Much of our American mythology and how we conceptualize and self-imagine ourselves and look back in time is connected to the desert. And so because it was the apex of this colonization project and this three-way conflict between the Indians, the white people, and the Mexicans, and then at times the Spanish, it's this total world of dreams that McCarthy taps into perfectly. But what's interesting about that is that if you are the first person to do something, that automatically makes you super epic, right? Melville in Moby Dick charts out the sea and the dark unconscious of the Gnostic turbid waters and all the first stuff in the, for the first time in the English language, especially in a modern context, in an epic way. And so we are in this anxiety of influence behind Melville. But the sea is something very common to write about. For instance, or like the Northeast or New York City or Los Angeles or California in Steinbeck's case, a couple decades before McCarthy. So many of the more common landscapes that we know of, whether that's California, the Midwest, the South, or the Northeast here in America, were already staked out by American authors. And Cormac McCarthy is one of the greatest American authors of all time. And that's why I run a Cormac McCarthy book club and a Cormac McCarthy course over on Substack. So every single month, we read a Cormac McCarthy novel. We are 16 or 17 months into our book club and have already read through his works once and are going to do it again and do it for years to come. I also have dozens of hours of content on McCarthy's life, his books, and a bunch of other cool stuff over on Substack. I have an unreleased Cormac McCarthy interview. I have a Blood Meridian for Writers course where I show the writing tricks McCarthy does in Blood Meridian and so much more. Plus, you get access to the rest of my Substack, which includes the Right Conscious Book Club, the most active book club in the world, where we read over 5 novels every single month, and over 100 hours of content on Substack about writing and other authors. I have content coming out there every single day. I do live streams. I have free and paid content. I do free live streams over there. And if you do not know, Substack is the home of the literary renaissance. In November, I'm going to be relaunching my free writing school and doing so much cool stuff over there. And so if you are not reading all the cool stuff over on Substack, then you don't know how good some of the modern writing out there is. And so if you guys want to support me and the literary renaissance, I will put the link down below. I would love to see you guys in our upcoming book clubs. In November, we are going to be reading The Road. In January, February, and March, we are going to be going through the Border trilogy. Then we'll be back to Blood Meridian and so on and so forth. And so I'll put the link down there and let's hop back to the video. And when you look at McCarthy's competition, in 1983, 2 years before Blood Meridian, Dennis Johnson, one of the American greats, in his novel Angels, explores America. But he doesn't explore the landscape, in my opinion, very well. Leslie Marmon Silko in 1977, who Cormac McCarthy actually had a rivalry with, I won't talk about that, in her novel Ceremony. And funny enough, we're reading actually Ceremony and Dennis Johnson in my book club in the next 2 months. But she captures the desert pretty well, but she doesn't have that literary ambition that McCarthy has in this novel with his omniscient narration. Frank Herbert in Dune, writes about the desert as an American author in this beautiful way, but it's on the planet Arrakis. And he has this whole ecological system and, obviously science fiction elements that kind of separate it from the American mythos and ideal and our conception of the desert. And then when you even look at Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey is a good attempt. Desert Notes by Barry Lopez are very good nonfiction pieces on the desert, but they're nonfiction. And novels like Abbey's Monkey Wrench Game have nothing in terms of the stylistic equivalents to McCarthy. And so now that the desert has been mythologized and canonized so much in our consciousness because of Hollywood and Westerns, when we see someone, and this is the power of a novel, when we see someone take a flat, bleak landscape and light it on fire and then infuse it with occulted and hidden mystical systems within the text, we're mind blown. And that's the power of the novel. The problem with movies is that they don't show interiority. They almost at all. And when they do, it's usually kind of choppy and has to be done in a very limited way. in something like Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, we get this omniscient narration from the perspective not of God. That's something that McCarthy and other authors in the last 5 or 6 decades, even since Melville figured out, you're not an omniscient narrator. There is this omniscient narrator who is also limited in a sense, which creates the tonality and personality of these omniscient narrators, and that's why they differ, between these books. And so McCarthy being able to bring this depth to something that we've all fantasized about. McCarthy said in an interview, I think in 2007 with the Wall Street Journal, if I'm remembering correctly, why did you start writing Westerns? Because McCarthy had written 4 novels about the South, had written 2 screenplays, and then shifted for the rest of his career outside of The Road and The Passenger, for 5 or 6 projects to the West. Especially the Southwest. And he said that I wanted to write about something that everybody would know about. He wanted to be more accessible. And he said that people in Mongolia know about cowboys and Indians and the mythology of the Wild West. And so by being the first person to actually give it depth and style and bring in that omniscient narration that wasn't like McMurtry and some of these other people, there have been Westerns with omniscient narration. And sometimes they're better stories. Blood Meridian is somewhat plotless. Like there are driving forces, but there aren't love scenes and tension in the typical sense, which many of these other Western tropes kind of have. And that's why Blood Meridian's been kind of called an anti-Western before, But all of that brought to life something we dream about. And that's why it's interesting that the Blood Meridian has kind of had a refound success after the success of No Country for Old Men, then obviously Wendigoon, and even people like me making a bunch of content and t-shirts about it, because now our mind can handle it. Now our mind, in retrospect, can look back at this time historically, now that we're disconnected, and with the programming of, seeing so many Hollywood movies, and then listening to books or reading books like Empire of the Summer Moon, and kind of learning about this history of the Indians and their conflicts with the Spanish and the white people, and the war of independence in Texas, and all of this stuff. We learn about it all, and it deepens our appreciation of what McCarthy was doing here. And also the power of this is that McCarthy took a tale that was true. McCarthy followed the path of Shakespeare. Shakespeare just stole plots, stole things that were already there, and then just put a story around it, like, Macbeth and Lear. And it's a really smart move, because you don't need to worry about the plot if you are a stylist, if you can tap into this archetypal omniscient energy, which, someone like Shakespeare can do, or explore characters and motivations in this stuff at length. And that's why it's interesting when you read like The Tempest or A Midnight Summer's Dream or Love Labor's Lost, like some of these, the original kind of Shakespeare plays that he made up. When he doesn't have these framing devices or these characters and can't play with their motivations, he falls more into mythology and, fairies and, all of this stuff. But back to McCarthy, who was very much inspired by Shakespeare. He was really lucky to write this at the point in his life and in history, because what separates people, and we can talk about canonization now of what separates people like a Cormac McCarthy from, let's say, a Tolstoy or a Dostoevsky, is that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in their, or maybe we can even talk about Melville, it's somewhat harder for them to hide what they are really talking about. And what do I mean by that? Well, in Blood Meridian, and most people wouldn't get this, I've known countless people who read this novel, there is in Blood Meridian explorations of Christianity. There are also deep explorations of Gnosticism, with McCarthy saying words like the Ogdoad and many other different Gnostic elements. There are explorations in Freemasonry, the Kabbalah, numerology, tarot, astrology, Eastern mysticism, all within Blood Meridian, but it's been occulted. It isn't very apparent. Some of it is like the tarot, what's exactly going on? And it's very high level stuff, because, the cliche that people that, I'll be nice here, that beginning writers and people that don't know anything about writing say is that you don't want to preach, right? You don't want to talk about a system. You don't want to write a book that's this hidden message about Christianity and have someone preaching the entire time. But advanced writers know how to hide all that stuff. But the greatest writers of all time, and this is a modern innovation, this is something that we've realized with actually the influx of information. And McCarthy was an early technological savant, in the sense that there was a recent article in the Smithsonian magazine that detailed that Cormac McCarthy had a library of over 20,000 books and had a photographic memory. And I know this is kind of like building on this like urban legend of McCarthy idea, But if you've ever listened to him talk, if you've listened to what he writes about, and you listen to people that knew him, he did read a lot of those books. He was a very well-read individual with a high level of recall. And so how do you bring that into a novel? Well, McCarthy didn't like postmodernism. He wasn't necessarily a big fan of the David Foster Wallaces and this stuff, even though he did read Wittgenstein's Mistress by David Markson, which I have a video about that, and actually took something from that and put it in The Road. So he did read postmodernist literature and actually did kind of delve into that style a little bit more in The Passenger, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But in general, he didn't really name drop too much in his career, even in some of his more modern novels. Didn't explore these like ideas at length, like someone like a Thomas Pynchon, a David Foster Wallace, even a Tom Wolfe, a Norman Mailer, a Don DeLillo, the Toni Morrison. I can go on and on. McCarthy more focuses on the ambition of the style, of these ideal transcendent elements. And so that ability, though, to have all this information in his head is much like what we have today, because 75 years ago, or 150 years ago, 200 years ago, whenever, our families were all working class and maybe illiterate. And it wasn't until recently, like my grandpa was a cement layer, it wasn't until recently we, as a collective, have had this ability to have access to basically unlimited information and be able to recall it and move it around and mess with it. And, that really started with modernism and, that whole artistic revolution and the normalization of, public education with everybody. But now we can fully work with information. But McCarthy is an interesting case because he basically had that ability. He has access to all this information, but he has a connection to the old world. He went to a Jesuit school. He went through the Trivium method. His father was a valedictorian of Yale Law School. He was talented. He was raised in a good school. He had successful brothers and sisters with a winning mentality, a high standard. He took the artistic path. He renounced this beautiful life, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about McCarthy's greatest novel of all time. And so he can live between worlds. He can be writing about Holden, which is really a representation of scientific materialism, hyper-rationality, many of the problems that we're seeing today, and show him in a very early archetypal form in the Southwest and still make it feel, still balance that tension between old and new really well. And that's what he does with all of these systems and the implementation of them. He is so versed in the occult, in religion, in many of these different elements, in old words and alchemy. I mean, it includes alchemy in this. The Philosopher's Stone is involved with Black and White Jackson and all of that. Volcano scene, like I could go on, and I do over in my Blood Meridian course and in my McCarthy course in general. But with all this hermetic sealing, with all this occulting on a literary level, it requires you to be an initiate to that knowledge to be able to understand it. And that is really good for people like maybe you and I who are willing to study it and reread it and dive into some of these sentence elements and all of this. And that's why it is a masterpiece. That's why it's so important. It's epic in so many different ways. But one of the reasons why it's number 3 on my list is that a lot of the human elements are lost in the novel. And I get it. That's the plot of the novel. There's this failed messianic journey that the kid is on, and he eventually succumbs to it or fails in that journey. But there isn't much characterization, there isn't much growth, there isn't much reflection. Judge Holden has these epic scenes where he is speaking from, this demiurgic kind of point of view, from this tyrannical archetypal point of view, and it's at such a high level and such a cool style. It's this Nietzschean, Ubermensch just in reality, just like, oh my God, he's got the highest IQ of anybody in the region, And what he's saying is the philosophy of the time in through that lens. It's like he's showing us the highest ideal of this. But with all this omniscient narration and all this grand stuff that McCarthy's doing, that kind of falls flat because the only thing that a modern reader can kind of do with that is kind of And there's a lot of stuff a modern reader can do with all the occulted information and deepening their experience with the Southwest and all of that. But okay, this is our origins. We are violent by design. This is what happened there. This is what the full demiurgic control looks like. But so what? And this is where a lot of people who analyze this novel and don't necessarily like it kind of get to with this. And I think that's tragic because they're missing all this other stuff. And they're missing that if you want to understand the American experience in general, if you want to understand the craziest period of history where people were stretched to the extreme and there were collisions of so many different cultures and we learned so much about ourselves as a collective, then this novel is required. It is in the canon for that. It's in the canon, in my opinion, in general. On a stylistic level, it's, because it's this Southwest axiomatic pillar, it is also. But, and I should say, if you are new to this stuff, if you're new to violence and new to the exploitation of people and the depth of this world, it's shocking. It can change your life. It can really make you think and feel instead of just seeing it on a film or reading it in a history book. And so I get that. It makes you hug your family closer at night. But over time, what internal changes come from reading Blood Meridian? How is it transformative? And like I said, I could give a whole lecture on what it is, but it doesn't pack as much of a punch, as the two novels in front of it. It maybe doesn't pack up the same punch in a transformative lens as some of the novels behind it, but its stylistic excellency and its ambitious narration and so many other things can lift it up. Because McCarthy has the ability to write from this human point of view and make you care about characters. The Border trilogy, Sutree, some of these novels, The Passenger, all these novels that we're going to be talking about today, at least some of them have this. And he had that ability then. But, something that happened to McCarthy is that McCarthy once said, when asked, why are you such a good writer? Like, how did you get this good, bro? How did you achieve this stylistic excellence and all this stuff? And he said, it's because I had the biggest ego. He was highly competitive. He was resentful about the neglect from his family, the abuse from his family, the support that he didn't receive as an artist, the neglect that society gave him, the lack of success that he had. All this is hard, you guys. Like, honestly, this novel sold 1,800 copies in the first for 7 years after its publication until Cormac blew up on the scene. 1,800 copies. That's nothing. And it was coming out from Random House. And McCarthy, from the start of his career, believed that he deserved success. He believed that his skill should merit some form of reward. And for many years, for decades, that didn't happen. But in 1981, 4 years before Blood Meridian came out, McCarthy received the MacArthur Fellowship, which in today's money is like receiving $1 million. And that was huge for him. That enabled him to buy a house. Houses today, the average cost is a lot. But back then, with that purchasing power, it enabled him to buy a house and for him to finally feel appreciated as an artist. Something that, people don't talk about, with him dating that 16-year-old girl, that is a pure ego move about, him not caring about the FBI or going to prison and all this stuff. He just had this insane belief in himself and in taking whatever he wanted and making it happen. And so after he got that fellowship, he has the space and the time, and in 1979, if I remember correctly, he publishes Sutree, which is a masterpiece, and then he publishes Blood Meridian. So he went on this run of writing these two great novels, releasing them within 6 years of each other, canonical novels, in my opinion. Harold Bloom would agree. He got that taste of money, of power, of fame, and realized that these really high-level prose novels with this crazy layering and all this stuff going on weren't going to sell copies, weren't going to get him to the next level, weren't going to blow him up and get famous enough to date a 22-year-old girl when he was in his 50s or whatever. Because even though he had $1 million, he was still an unknown writer. It's not going to buy him the Ferraris that he loved and all the other stuff. And so what's awesome about this novel is that we have an author whose back is basically against the wall and he feels like he's never really going to go anywhere, and he's just writing to write. He's just doing prose and working with ideas at the highest level and doing a project that doesn't need to be human, that doesn't, and that's what Blood Meridian is for McCarthy. If you look at his entire bibliography, Blood Meridian, even though it feels cohesive, is where he really doesn't care at all about some of the kind of traditional things that he even worries about in some of his other novels. And so talking about Blood Meridian can be really hard because when you build it up, when you build any book up, there's going to be a subset of people who are just going to be let down. And that's actually, we're kind of in the process of that. We're downstream of Windy Goon and my 200 videos and many McCarthy adaptions and his death and the launch of The Passenger. And, once the Blood Meridian movie comes out, there's going to be this effect where a wide number of people who are recommended this novel are going to hate it. But even more so, there has been lately a flattening of the conversation surrounding the novel. You know, cliches like Judge Holden is the devil and stuff. Judge Holden fan art that's like created by AI and all that is running amok, which is fine. But the glorification of violence in this novel is somewhat silly and a bad way to prime people for it. Because what people should be looking out for is, maybe if we want to talk about violence, this idea that we are violent by design, that we are violent because we are living in this Gnostic demiurgic world that McCarthy creates throughout many of his novels. We are maybe violent because we're being urged by the demiurge or an archon like Judge Holden to engage in evil. Maybe we live in this cultural moment. All that could be explored. But there is a crowd of people out there who go and watch the crappy horror movies and are just totally flattened and don't think, don't care, and who are post-literate and can read, are kicking this into the wrong sector. And I'm not here to gatekeep, but I'm interested in the future of this novel, in the sense that now with McCarthy kind of getting canceled, with the Blood Meridian movie not looking too hopeful in my opinion, and this new breed of readers who are obsessed with violence, with this Judge Holden character, because many of them are nihilists in their own hearts and are actually looking not at him as this rambler, as this idiot, you know, which he is. Even the men know it. They just like turn away when he's done talking, like, yeah. And it's, yeah, because they're idiots, but he's not really preaching anything except this simple, you know, animal law idea. But with all that, where's the reputation of this going to go? Plus, you know, me talking about this, plus me, people like me and you building this novel up, it's definitely going to have an interesting future in the literary conversation. And so, of course, I recommend you read this. This is mandatory reading for everyone out there. Let's go. You have to read Blood Meridian if you haven't. Let me just tell you, I just went on this entire spiel. If you have not read this, go buy it right now. This is a great first McCarthy novel. You will be mind blown, especially if you care about words. And so this ranks for me number 3 out of 11 of Cormac McCarthy's novels. In terms of the canon, I feel like this is one of the better novels of the 20th century for sure. It should make any top 50 best novel of all time list, especially if you're only putting one McCarthy novel in there. One of the 4 I'm gonna kind of talk about at the top need to be in there. It's probably the greatest Western of all time. It for sure is one of the more innovative Westerns of all time. And so I feel like it's going to be in the canon and have a well-deserved spot in the canon moving forward for a really long time. And I want to thank everyone out there who has recommended Blood Meridian to somebody, whether they read it or not, because that's how literature spreads. That's how ideas spread, that you try and eventually you get it to somebody who cares about it. Like, I remember my boy Andy reading Blood Meridian and being like, holy cow, back when we were 18, 19 years old. And he was the first person I knew who read it once I gave it to him. And it was like, yes, finally. And he was so funny. He would, you know, he lived in a different state. And when he would go to bars and stuff, he'd be quoting Judge Holden and stuff. So funny. But that's one of the ways we create a literary renaissance. And so, speaking of McCarthy, what is the second novel on my list? And a little bit earlier, you guys heard me talk about how Blood Meridian doesn't really have this human element. It has this visceral, raw human experience, but it doesn't play on your heartstrings. It doesn't feel like you are transforming your conception of God unless you are trying to tap into this Gnostic prison planet devil archon ideal. And so my second ranked Cormac McCarthy novel is, of course, The Crossing. And so The Crossing is book number 2 of the Border trilogy, but you could read book number 1 or book number 2 first, because in book number 3, some of the characters come together. And so it doesn't really matter the ordering. In a timeline sense, technically The Crossing takes place before All the Pretty Horses, starting in the early 1940s and kind of then pushing through the 40s. And so this novel, if you don't know, is about a boy, about two brothers named Billy and Boyd Parham, who go on this journey and cross into Mexico. And that's what the entire Border trilogy is about. It's about these young American boys, Billy Parham, Boyd, John Grady Cole, Rollins, all these young men who have these romantic ideals of Mexico. Because in the 1940s and the 1950s, we weren't in the old world anymore, but we weren't in the new world yet. especially in these more rural areas of New Mexico in The Crossing, and then in Western Texas in All the Pretty Horses. But things were getting closed off. There was the barbed wiring of the United States. There was basically the closing off of the range, so you couldn't ride horses anymore. And in both stories of the Border Trilogy, the young protagonists have this ideal, whether in this novel of a rewilding of America and of the soul, or in the Border Trilogy, this kind of return to the ways of the Comanche and stuff like that. There's this ideal, and so the characters set off on this inverted Arthurian romance because, as you guys know, McCarthy only writes tragedies, and so it's beautiful. And there's actually many windmills placed in the start of these journeys to kind of show this Don Quixote fool's journey thing going on. And in especially The Crossing, I feel like McCarthy brings all of his best skills together into one. And so what are some of McCarthy's best skills? Well, one is, if you've ever read one of his novels, is the dream scenes, whether that's Sheriff Bell in No Country for Old Men, or Alicia Western in The Passenger, Cola in Outer Dark, Sutree, whatever. The dream scenes, these italicized things that McCarthy does, whether he's talking about the past in this nostalgic and fragmented way or an actual dream, are some of his best writing by far. And I love that choice to use italics, because when you think of McCarthy, right, and his lack of punctuation, even commas at times, and basically any other form of punctuation, he used, I think, like 10 or 13 semicolons in his first novel, and then maybe one in the second, and then abandoned them completely. And obviously abandoned quotation marks too, but this italicized stuff is done better in The Crossing than maybe any other novel, and it's done at length. It's done a ton. In this novel, McCarthy really peaks, in my opinion, with his mythopoetic voice. He has the old ability still in his heart that's kind of lost, I think, because of age by the time he reaches The Road and No Country for Old Men. One can even say his third novel, Cities of the Plain. He's creating the narrative himself because there's something, here's something cool about McCarthy. In the late 1970s, McCarthy wanted to become famous, as I was talking about before, and he couldn't, so he started writing screenplays. He wrote a screenplay called The Gardener's Son, and it got turned into a straight-to-TV movie, and that did okay. And then he was trying to write an As I Lay Dying screenplay for Hollywood, which didn't get picked up, and he wrote 2 other screenplays, actually 3 others, one called No Country for Old Men, one called Cities of the Plain, and one called Stella Maris. And what's interesting is that later in his career, starting in the mid-1990s, McCarthy, and I've been to the Cormac McCarthy archive and looked at the Cities of the Plain screenplay and the No Country for Old Men screenplay. He basically adapted those screenplays and just took a lot of the core of that and made it into a novel. And he added his own flourishes and stuff, but they weren't formed from nothing. And actually, The Crossing is the last original novel that McCarthy wrote. I mean, he had the template for these characters in Cities of the Plain, which is when some of the main characters meet up, but he wrote like these prequels to that story. Because when we look at the 2000s, McCarthy released No Country for Old Men, which is adapted. He released The Road, but The Road is somewhat of an exception because McCarthy finished that that novel draft, his first draft, in an unprecedented amount of time, in like 6 weeks, and didn't spend that much time revising it. So it's his least revised novel, and one can say well thought out novel, and it's just him just kind of working through the story, which is fine, and we'll talk about The Road a little bit later. Then he published his screenplay, The Sunset Limited and The Counselor, but those are screenplays or plays. And then he published The Passenger, which he had been working on since like 1963. And so one could say The Crossing is really his last great original effort as an author, where he forms everything. And you could definitely see it. There is more room in it. If you want to know about McCarthy's conception of nature and God, this is the place. He has Dostoevsky level side quests and analyses of God in this. Also on death, on life, on love, and so many other things. And so going back to this idea of everything coming together in this novel, something that McCarthy does well is write these nostalgic novels about the fall of the old world. And he puts these young protagonists, like in his first novel, John Wesley Ratner or Sutree, or these characters in the Border Trilogy, or Bobby Western, or even one could say like a Lester Ballard, whose necrophilia kicks off because of the loss of his family farm, because of, the the government enacting eminent domain. So McCarthy really likes to turn up the nostalgia machine. And so this novel has that. He loves to do these italicized dream and flashback scenes. This has a lot of that. He loves to write about nature and have this beautiful nature stuff. This novel has more of that than any other novel. He loves to go on to do these kind of side quests, which aren't as prevalent in like Blood Meridian or like The Road as much. Like there are some, like The Slave Trader and some of the stories and stuff, but in general it sticks to this kind of linear path. This novel does not. This novel has human elements. You know, the entire Boulder trilogy features romance. If you can imagine McCarthy doing that without someone's sister. Yes, you know, there's romance with prostitutes. And technically every girl in all three books are under the age of 18, but they're dating men that are also young. But that's also just kind of funny. I remember on the Cormac McCarthy Reddit, people would be talking about me and like, why is he focused on all this stuff? He's implying that Cormac McCarthy is a pedophile or a weird guy. And I was like, guys, in every single one of his novels, he writes either about incest or having sex with underage women. When he was in his 50s, he dated this girl in her early 20s. He describes himself in interviews before that period as having young girlfriends. What does that mean? I have a video titled Cormac McCarthy and Jeffrey Epstein, if you want to go watch that one, about Jeffrey Epstein funding the Santa Fe Institute and only moving to New Mexico because of the Santa Fe Institute. And Cormac McCarthy being on the board of trustees that approved the donation from Jeffrey Epstein after his first arrest. How involved he was in that decision, I have no idea, but the Santa Fe Institute won't comment on that. Nonetheless, though, not to sidetrack us, McCarthy has all of his best stuff in here. One thing I could say that's missing in this is maybe some of this egotistic fire prose that we get in like Blood Meridian and Sutree that's just going crazy, but it's still there, but it's not as aggressive. But the story is not aggressive. This is a very emotional story, a contemplative story, a road story, of these young boys on the road in Mexico and the various things and triumphs and tragedies that they encounter. This novel is the perfect showing of what McCarthy talks about when he talks about the evil of the Southwest, the evil in Mexico. In the McCarthy novel, I can't remember. It's in Cities of the Plain. They're talking to someone, and he says that, and the character says that in Mexico, evil walks on its own 2 feet, like it's independent. And McCarthy found his spot. McCarthy kind of believed in this violent by design ideal when he was writing his Southern Gothic literature, which we'll get to in a second. But that works in the South because people are just weird, and then there's all this slavery stuff going on. But McCarthy was never really connected to that. In his first novel, he kind of tries to talk about this, he tries to work with some of the slavery stuff, but that's more reserved for William Faulkner's bibliography, which is very connected to the Old South and the transition and all that. But McCarthy taps into something different in his Southern Gothic novels, but it's a little bit harder to explain. And I think now in context, now that we know about people like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the video, his Southern works make a little bit more sense if you were doing that framing. But if you transplant McCarthy's style, which is violent, and his violent kind of tendencies to the Southwest, which has been this bloodbath area for a couple centuries, it makes things much easier. But this novel is really good because when you look at something like his screenplay, The Counselor, or No Country for Old Men, it's caught up in cartel violence. And when we hear about the cartels, it's just kind of something that we're just like, well, what are you going to do? Bomb a boat? Like, really? Like, if you don't focus on the symptom, the cause, which is our need for drugs here in America, hundreds of billions of dollars in drugs is deep need, then you're never going to really solve that problem. But before that existed, in the 1940s, in the 1950s, when the Border Trilogy happened, Mexico wasn't some oasis. Mexico wasn't really a place you wanted to be because of the instability, whether that was because of revolutionary groups and other problems down more in the central and south parts of the country, or in the north, the instability because a lot of these people were unregulated. These military officers or farmers or groups or whoever up in the north were basically able to do whatever the hell they wanted without that much regulation. And so this novel tracks that. This novel shows this pre-cartel Mexico that is still violent, that still has problems, and shows these visceral scenes of dishonorable acts, one could say, by these citizens of Mexico. And I should say that people do dishonorable acts everywhere in the world. This isn't McCarthy trying to shit on Mexico, but it's him working through this idea that he has and finding a place where he can do it in the modern world, especially a place where it's more societally acceptable still to treat animals really bad, to screw with the outsiders and kill them and do all this stuff. And like I said, that's not to say that in 1945, if you are in northern North Dakota, that wouldn't be happening either. But there has to be an other in the novel. And for Americans, that other, especially down on this in the South, is Mexico. And it's not just in this negative manner, like, oh, these violent Mexicans or something like that, but rather it's also in the sense that there is a dreaminess, there is a nostalgia that people down in Mexico still care about horses. They still care about the old ways and the honor code and all of this stuff, which is something that young men still dream about wanting, this openness. And so as America was closing itself off, Mexico wasn't there just yet. And so that's what The Crossing is about. The first book of this, which involves a wolf, is some of the best writing McCarthy ever did. And a lot of people feel like the story drops off after that, but in my opinion, it just takes a new philosophical direction, which is absolutely awesome. This is McCarthy's most philosophical novel. And like I said, there's just so much beauty in this. There are lessons and characterization and passages that really no other McCarthy novel has. And so if you are a good reader and can handle some meanderings by McCarthy, and it's just not all go, 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 who's the next, encampment we're going to kill, like you get in a Blood Meridian, or even something like The Road or No Country for Old Men, these more thriller books, then The Crossing is an absolute masterpiece. And so just a second ago, I mentioned Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. Well, at the bottom on my list, let's talk about my least favorite Cormac McCarthy novel, and the one I think is the weakest, and Cormac McCarthy would agree with me. So in the early 1970s, Cormac McCarthy was broke. The Orchard Keeper and The Outer Dark, his first two novels, did not sell very well. And his wife was nagging him. She was nagging him about writing something that was more accessible. And McCarthy wasn't going to write some airplane thriller or something like that. But McCarthy, which is kind of a trend that you're hearing me talk about, did try to write something more accessible, as much as he personally could, especially at this kind of more egotistical stage of his life. Because now with all this information we have, and it's something I've been talking about for years, McCarthy loves stuff. McCarthy had all these Ferraris and sports cars, was using $10,000 checks as bookmarks. He was very frivolous with his money and had a lot of it. He was not donating it to charity or trying to be modest about it. And in the 1970s, after he wrote this, he continued after this one commercially failed to write screenplays and then eventually write Westerns to, become the multimillionaire he is now. Or was, I should say. And so in the early 1970s, though, McCarthy did two really good novels, The Orchard Keeper and Outer Dark, that were very technical, really high-level stuff, especially for a young writer in his late 20s and his early 30s who kind of got in the game a little bit late. McCarthy didn't start writing until he was like 23, 24 years old, if not a little bit older, and didn't start writing until he was in his late 20s. He was like going to school and stuff and, writing a couple short stories, but nothing like crazy. And so McCarthy had just finished his second novel, Outer Dark, and had to cut around 10,000 words of that. And he writes his editor and says, I need money. Can you give me an advance for two more novels, which would be Child of God and Sutree? And the editor said, okay, what do you have? He said, I have the Sutree thing, but it's not done yet. It's not anywhere near done. But I can whip something up. And so McCarthy combined this 10,000 word thing that he cut with this historical event that was happening around this time called the Lula Lake Murders. And the Lula Lake Murders were two unsolved murders at this place called Lula Lake, which was very close to where McCarthy was living in Northwest Georgia. And two people, this young couple, were murdered. And they were having sex in their car, and someone obviously was watching them and murdered them. And eventually this guy named Blevins, yes, that's the name of one of the main characters of All the Pretty Horses, was found. And he was known to be a snoop around the area. It was an area where people had sex in their car, and he would go and be a voyeur. And they put him on trial, but eventually they didn't have enough evidence and he was acquitted. And so this was a huge news story for McCarthy, and we actually have his notes about this in the Cormac McCarthy archive, so we know that that's where the conception of this novel came from. And later on, when James Franco was filming this video, he called Cormac McCarthy and said, "Why did you make this? Or write this, excuse me." And McCarthy said, "Some dumb reason." And so Child of God was a cash grab. It was an easy novel for him to get done as fast as possible. And when you look at his notes, when you look at his journals, he was trying to almost do like personal development, keep pace, writing like, I'm going to finish the first draft by October 1st. And, I'm going to do 1,400 words per day, which was somewhat rare for him. And the only reason that anyone could argue that this isn't McCarthy's worst novel is two reasons. The first being, or I could say three reasons. The first being that the name Child of God has attracted so many people to this novel. Out of all Cormac McCarthy's Southern Gothic works, this is his most read by far. If you combine the amount of good read ratings on The Orchard Keeper, Sutree, and Outer Dark and put them together, they are still less than the amount of ratings on Child of God. And that's for a couple reasons. First of all, the name Child of God evokes people to want to read it. I remember when I was 17, I was hanging out with my dad because he was a professor, and there was this coffee shop across the street from UNLV, and it's no longer there. And we went to it, and it had like all these bookshelves in there that you could like, I guess, just read the books and then put them back. And I had read 5 or 6 Cormac McCarthy novels, and I saw Child of God on the bookshelf by McCarthy, and I was like, oh my God, what a title. I have to read this. And I remember my dad saying like, oh, you can't steal this. I'm not going to let you. And so then I got it from my school library the next day. And so first of all, the name matters. When you know about McCarthy from like watching No Country for Old Men or seeing the Road movie, you have this kind of priming that he's this violent dude, especially if you just watch the movies. And many of us have experienced religious trauma or are religious. It's kind of funny, right? And so when you hear someone like McCarthy, who is maybe more writes in the vein of evil, talking about God, the child of God, your interest is going to be heightened. And if you have moved away from Christianity or are in a battle with it or whatever, and you see child of God and you see McCarthy doing it, you may think he's critiquing it. Because I'm wondering, I just wonder, how did this one get so much more attention than these other ones? On top of that, so the next day I went to my school library, and by that point I had read all the Westerns basically. The entire Border trilogy, No Country for Old Men, I read The Road, and then Blood Meridian. And so then when I saw Child of God, which only comes in at 35,000 words, and then I read it, I was like, oh, this was awesome because it was really easy. I remember reading The Crossing, and it was I think I first read it when I was 14. It was a slog at times, because of some of those meandering side quests I just talked about. When I was about 15, I read Blood Meridian, but the style was a little bit too much. But when I read Child of God, I was like, oh, wow, here we go. This is about this Lester Ballard guy, this kind of weirdo. And then I was finished with it like that. I remember finishing in like 2 or 3 days. I would just read in class. One of the reasons why I didn't do well in math, I would just be reading all through every math class. And I remember I had this teacher, Miss Klein, and she was like, Ian, put the book away. I was like, are you really going to stop a young man from reading the greatest literature of all time? And I was like reading something like important that day, like Dostoevsky or something when she did that to me. And then she went, oh, and I kept reading. So in comparison, The Crossing is 5 times as long as this. Sutree is 6 times as long as this. Most other McCarthy novels, technically every single one other than Outer Dark, are at least twice as long as this. The Road also is a little bit shorter than that. So length, everyone, does matter. I don't care what your girlfriend told you. And so then you could say, okay, Ian, there are plenty of novels that are short and still perform really well, that still can pack a punch. But when I look at Child of God, there are so many different things missing. There are some, I don't want to say supernatural elements, but the novel is in conversation with many of the Gnostic things that McCarthy does in the cave scene and many of these different things. It is an emotional novel. We do follow a protagonist and kind of see his downfall and see a more I mean, it's one of the only times that we actually follow one of these decrepit, violent McCarthy characters throughout an entire novel. One could say that like the gardener's son and other stuff, but though the Lester Ballard is screwed up at the start and screwed up at the end. And so that's cool to see, you know, this violence on the page and a kind of an analysis of the character. But McCarthy doesn't really do that much interiority. He does some metafictional stuff with Lester's, you know, seeing himself through a child's eye and like stuff like that to kind of bridge the gap between us and Lester Ballard. And if you guys don't know what the story is about, this story is about a necrophiliac. I'll just say it. I should say a guy who falls into that. And this is such a good precursor. You know, Cormac McCarthy knew about this new violence that was coming. He knew that people like Dahmer and Bundy and all these people were going to come because of this violence. He knew that like that Columbine school shooting energy was going to happen when he was writing things like No Country for Old Men and all of that. He philosophizes about it in The Passenger. Like he definitely was really on top of that stuff. And one could say this is, you know, if you just want these thriller elements or just a basic narrative, that this is better than what it is. But I don't come to a McCarthy novel for just basic narrative and thriller elements. Honestly, I come for something more, it's not supernatural, but something elevated, something more literary. Because And I should say really fast that Child of God is still a really good novel. You know, there has to be a novel at the bottom of my list, at the bottom of my ranking. And so Child of God is better than 99% of stuff coming out right now. Child of God is better than a lot of books its size, a lot of thriller books, or a lot of more narrative focused books. It's still a really fun novel. But there really isn't anything to gain from this except McCarthy just kind of going after his dad. Like this story kicks off because, and this is in the first page, Lester Ballard's home is put up for eminent domain and he's basically rendered homeless and it becomes his wanderer. And when you're a wanderer, it's easier to kind of fall into trouble and get yourself into these situations. McCarthy's dad was the acting attorney in the entire Knoxville County region who was enacting eminent domain on countless people and throwing them off of their land that they had sometimes been on for centuries, or at least a century or two. And so McCarthy, in combination with his dad being abusive, really rebukes his father time after time. And this is just another example of that. And so there's no supernatural elements that are like elevating this in a transcendent manner. There's really no transformative narrative elements other than, oh, poor man. Then when I look at the style, I mean, it's at a peak of McCarthy's style, so there's some really good stylistic things going on here, but the length kind of takes away from that, and even the narrative takes away from that, because when you look at something like a Sutree or an Out of Dark, there's a lot more meandering going on, where we can kind of see that style flex. There are no real good side quests. There are really not too many great italicized scenes. So I think this book is favored by a lot of people because on its first pass, it reads really clean. If you just read through McCarthy's bibliography, this is going to be a place of rest for many people, especially those who aren't as ambitious of readers who, you know, when you're reading the 175,000 words of Sutree and the various difficulties in that, or the 150,000 words of The Crossing, or the 120 in Blood Meridian, it can feel like a slog. This is a breath of fresh air. Judging by the rating numbers, it's also a place where many people start. And when you maybe have read No Country, like I said, you've maybe seen some of those films or read like The Road or something, then you come to this and you're exposed to Southern Gothic literature that's, you know, pretty peppy. You know, one of the problems with Southern Gothic literature is, you know, if you read like As They Lay Dying, it's meandering, or even just a lot of Faulkner, it can be somewhat hard to access at times. If you read Flannery O'Connor, as much as I love her, sometimes it can be a little bit flat. It doesn't feel as active as something as Child of God. And so I get it. And that's why I still view it very highly in the Southern Gothic canon, especially for one of these more novella type works. And so really, yeah. So anyway, that's why I'm kind of placing it down a little bit lower, even though or at the bottom. But that doesn't mean it's not a good novel and that you guys shouldn't read it. And if you want to get into Southern Gothic literature, this is the most accessible of his Southern works, because as you'll kind of hear me talk about, his other Southern works are somewhat complicated. And let's just kind of piggyback off this one and talk about another one of his Southern works, which is Outer Dark. And I'm going to put this in slot number 11. And so McCarthy has technically 12 novels, but I'm going to combine The Passenger and Stella Maris into one because they basically are anyway. And so, as a reminder, number 2 on my list is The Crossing. Number 3 on my list is Blood Meridian. Number 11 on my list is Child of God. And coming in at number 7 is Outer Dark. And so, in December of 1962, McCarthy's first wife was leaving him. So, earlier that year, McCarthy got his wife Lee pregnant, and she was a writer. So she met Cormac in the English department in like the creative writing groups back at the University of Tennessee, 5 years earlier. They fell in love, and it kind of hit one of these situations that happens, and it's kind of sad, and this is why sometimes working artists don't really work out, is that, Cormac gets her pregnant, probably not a good idea, especially with their financial situation. And, Cormac has this talent, right? Cormac wrote these 2 short stories that we'll talk about later, Awake for Susan and A Drowning Incident, and won some contests that in like today's money would be like $1,000 or $2,000 if I remember correctly. And so McCarthy said, I have talent for this. I'm going to do this. I want to be this writer. And he committed to it fully. And as we see, like in retrospect, he really committed to it. Like he spent like 17 years or whatever, or, technically since the 1950s till 1981, trying to be a writer, 24 years of basically having no accolades, having no money. And so in 59, I think, or 60, he gets this publishing deal for The Orchard Keeper. And it gets accepted by Random House, but him and his editor, Albert Erskine, were having trouble. McCarthy was being pretty stubborn when you read the letters when it came to the editing. And so it was taking a while to fix it. It was one of these novels that had all this potential but needed a lot of editing. And Erskine was Faulkner's editor for some of his later novels and was a big deal. He was one of the he was, I would say, the best editor at Random House, which was like the best publishing house for literary fiction at that time. And he was working on other projects also. This was a side quest because it actually got picked up by somebody else. It got picked up by a junior editor and, accepted and brought into the ring. But eventually he left for like a different publishing house. And then the Orchard Keeper got into the lap of this Albert guy. And when you read about how much, it's just a quick side note about editing, these guys read so much. Like they would be reading these drafts of books like crazy. I mean, the big difference between then and now, if you hire an editor, they're working by the hour, right? And if you are a good editor, then you should be charging more than $100 an hour, right? Like if you are the Albert Erskine of 2025, are you worth $30 an hour? No. Well, how much are you worth? You're probably worth, near $100 an hour, if not more. But Albert Erskine was one of these dudes that was at the office for 10 plus hours a day, just chain smoking and dedicating his life to this stuff. And he would spend months working on a book. So how do you equate that? How do you equate someone with an immense amount of talent spending hundreds of hours, if not more, on one of your books at $100 an hour in today's money? This is one of the reasons why it's kind of harder for us to create some of these classics, because that's $20,000, $30,000 of editing. And that dude's on salary and he didn't care. But if you're trying to independently contract someone, that's the effort. And so as this is happening, Cormac McCarthy gets the advance. And as it's kind of crossing over into the finish line and they're working on kind of the end note stuff, McCarthy wants to start writing another novel because he's kind of sick of editing this stuff, but he hasn't come up with an idea yet. And so Lee has this baby and it's born in like the late fall of that year. And so she takes a little bit of time off. She takes a month off for like maternity leave, but she's going to work. She's like working like an actual job in the world. If I remember correctly, like not like a nurse, but like taking care of people, like doing something like that. And McCarthy's just writing, and his advance from Random House was like nothing like that significant in terms of money. And so she just had a baby and she's working 40 hours a week and she's a writer and she has ambitions. Later, she got a like PhD from Stanford in creative writing. She got like a big fellowship. She published a couple books. So she was a writer and wanted to continue to do this. And so Cormac's response to her, when she tells him, dude, you need to go get a job. We don't have enough money. Like we have to take care of this baby. Like this is insane. And his response to her was, you need to go get a second job. I'm not going to stop writing. And so then there was a subsequent divorce. But all this first initial fight of him saying, you need to go get a second job, even though you just had a baby a month ago, happened in December 15th. And that was the inspiration for this book. And so something that you'll find with many McCarthy novels is that, as I was saying, he either just straight up steals a story like a blood meridian, or he writes about his own life, or child of God, like speaking of stealing a story, or he writes about his own life. So The Orchard Keeper, as we'll talk about in a second, is about Cormac McCarthy and his upbringing in Tennessee. Outer Dark is him mythologizing his divorce. Sutree is literally autobiographical. The Road is about what he imagined would happen if he was in that situation with his son, like about a rumination on fatherhood. The Passenger has some autobiographical elements in it also. And then if you believe that the Augusta Britt angle, that McCarthy was writing about her in All the Pretty Horses, which, I could see it that is somewhat reasonable. If not her, other young women, as I've talked about before, that there are date discrepancies with letters and with her stories and letters. And it means that she either would have to be younger than 16 when he took her to Mexico, or there were multiple women, because 2 years before she says that they went to Mexico and did this thing, another writer, Guy Davenport, was writing to McCarthy, and he was mad because McCarthy was editing one of his books and helping him, and then McCarthy disappeared, and he wrote a letter to somebody else saying that McCarthy just took some young girl to Mexico. Well, that was 1974, and in the Vanity Piece article, Augusta Britt says that they went to Mexico in 97. So anyway, I have no idea, but apparently during that time, which is actually when he composed The Cities of the Plain screenplay, which features loving an underage prostitute in Mexico, he was in that world for sure. And so anyway, there are a lot of autobiographical things kind of going on in McCarthy's work. And these are ways to elevate what you're doing, right? Like, right when you hear about write about what you know, or like do what Shakespeare did, like it's, if you could take stuff off of your plate as a writer, then that's good, because if you're trying to manage everything, most likely that's just more things for you to fail in. Like if you can just throw out the entire concept of interiority like McCarthy does, then you don't have to worry about characterization as much. If you have these crazy, you know how to write about nature in this crazy way, your settings are always going to be on point. If you just steal some story and remix it from history or your own life, then you don't have to worry about a good plot that's realistic or something like that. It already is. All you have to do is amplify it. And so Outer Dark, I would say, is Cormac McCarthy's most symbolic book. And that's because in his first novel, The Orchard Keeper, he wrote a very technical novel. He was very ambitious in that. He actually put more of himself into that novel than anything else. Like when you read it, and I've read that one like 13 times for like the Cormac McCarthy course or something crazy like that, because I just had to keep rereading chapters. And then I realized at the end, it's like, dude, I read this so many times. But he got no appreciation for that. His editor was like, this is all too vague. This is all too technical. And so in his second novel, I think McCarthy, after the lack of success of his first, said, okay, well, I'm going to write this classic Southern Gothic, more abstract novel that's much more symbolic, and pull back and make almost no one question what's going on here. Because in The Orchard Keeper, there's a lot of like technical things going on. And so McCarthy says, I'm going to go full into the symbolic order. I'm going to frame this with a dream. I'm going to bring incest in. I'm going to bring the Bible in. I'm going to bring all these tropes in and see what happens. And I'm going to combine it with this experience I'm happening. His son was named Colin, and the protagonist of this story is named Cola. McCarthy uses people from his own life all the time, and Sutree sometimes by direct name, Blevins to Blevins. Like, we can go on all day about where McCarthy gets his names from, but a lot of the time it's from his life. And so moving forward, Outer Dark is an awesome novel because it's McCarthy really diving in to this almost minimal, vibey style that is rare for him. And kind of circling back to some of our markers of success, the supernatural is present in the story with the triune, and in its italicized sections are great. There are flashbacks in this novel that are great. There are two characters, Cola and Rinthi, that go on divergent paths. They're being haunted by ghosts that are in the outer dark, in Cola's nightmare, that at times can feel, the story can feel a little bit slow, especially on Rinthi's angle, but still you care about them. You want to see them succeed, or you want to boo them and be like, what are you doing, Cola? And some of the stories are cool. And it's actually a really good and well thought out novel because the same incidences that are framed at the start just kind of keep happening in, one could say, more hidden ways throughout the novel. And some of these big themes about God and Gnosticism and the South and violence and and especially guilt. Like the main theme of this novel is like guilt and like what happens to it when you have so much guilt that it manifests into life. All that stuff is explored beautifully. And this is where McCarthy really starts to dive into some of this side quest stuff that he gets into in his later novels. Like The Orchard Keeper didn't have as much as that, but the kind of the things we see in the Border trilogy and No Country for Old Men really start in Outer Dark. The writing, phenomenal. Like some of his best, writing he's ever done, because he's restraining himself. He's being a little bit more minimal. The characters, the creepiness of some of the people in this novel at a new level. Like just that you feel uncomfortable in this novel. Like whether it's Rinty talking about her nipples or like some of the weird people that like you have to encounter on the road and work for or bunk with, like all of that is like, oh my God. And everything related to the baby and like everything in this novel is just creepy and like very visceral. Like it's really well written. Like I've known a lot of people. This novel is actually surprisingly loved by a lot of women. I know, like, my wife loves this novel. One of our friends, Laura, loves this novel. I know, like, so many others, oddly, that, like, have read this novel and liked it. Which is, it's interesting to note because the McCarthy readership is over 90% men. When, like, YouTube is male-oriented for sure, but when I was making purely McCarthy content, I did, like, those 200 videos in, like, a year or something crazy like that. Like my demographics were like 98% men. And now that's definitely pulled back, that I'm talking about different people and like, a lot more authors and stuff. But anyway, like McCarthy is like the epicenter of the Lit Bros. That's why the Reddit is so hardcore and like the Logic Bros rule over there. I remember when I was like 19 or 20 going on that Reddit and asking a question and just getting Logic Bro'd. Just pure masculine energy, like trying to talk about theories or like, But it's interesting because this novel is an exploration of McCarthy's guilt. This is this almost auto-fiction weird thing going on where he explores one could say the worst thing that he's ever done. And he really regretted that later and did make up with his son, Colin, and, have a decent relationship with him. But still, it's not easy, especially because they just moved away. They moved away to Wyoming and just basically had no contact with them. And because we have access to McCarthy's journals, he fell into this state of depression while he was reading this. He went full sad boy mode. We think of Cowboy Cormac, but he was like, and this is fine. Like, we all do this in our head. We've all done this in a journal before if you were a journal keeper. But he's like writing about how sad he is, how he's having another dinner alone, like all this like kind of sentimental stuff that you wouldn't maybe expect from a guy like McCarthy or like the persona that like, the media has created around him. And so this is for sure McCarthy's trauma novel out of any of them, where is very direct. It's very visceral. And this one also flopped commercially. And yeah, it's really crazy to watch, a book like this sell 2,000 copies in the 25 years before McCarthy blew up. And so I recommend this novel. This novel comes in at 57,000 words, which isn't very much. It reads pretty fast. There is a lag. For the Cormac McCarthy course, I had to read this one like 5+ times too. There's a lag between like pages 50 and 125 or like 70 and 125, but that like sets up a lot of other stuff, just an FYI for you guys. And so if you have not picked this one up, it is a really strong novel. It's Southern Gothic to its core, more so than any of his other works. Like Child of God is like violent and stuff and more modern. This one takes place like at the turn of the century in an unknown place at an unknown time. And so it has a more mystical element to it. But I think, a lot of that mysticism by the time we hit Child of God and Sutree has been ripped away, or at least, and that's another thing. In Child of God, like the mysticism has been ripped away. But in Outer Dark, it's there for sure. And The Orchard Keeper. And so, speaking of fatherhood, speaking of McCarthy, let's go back down to the bottom of the list. So, of course, we are talking about Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And this is another one of Cormac McCarthy's shorter novels, coming in at only 58,000 words. As I mentioned earlier in the program, it is also it was also by far the quickest novel he ever wrote, finishing the first draft in under 2 months, and then the revision process didn't take very long either. When you compare that to the 60 years he worked on The Passenger, the 20+ years he worked on Sutree, the decades of space between the initial screenplays for No Country for Old Men and Cities of the Plain and their actual conversion to a novel, This one doesn't have that. Plus, McCarthy was in a more advanced stage. Plus, McCarthy kind of hopped onto this Santa Fe Institute bandwagon and became Mr. Science and was writing in the library and all of that. Which I think by the quality of this novel, which I think is still a really good novel, and some of the other stuff he was working on, wasn't maybe the best idea for him as a writer. But as I just talked about with Child of God, which is at the bottom of my rankings, The Road is coming in at number 10, which is second from the bottom. And that doesn't mean that this isn't a really good novel. This is an awesome novel. I did read this with a lot of my high school classes. They usually liked it. There's always the kid that says, oh, they just walk around, nothing happens, this is boring. But they wouldn't like anything. You could give them a thriller, you could give them some dumb story about some kid who plays basketball and whose mom dies and comes back and saves it all and gets the girl, and they would still complain. But let's talk about this novel. This novel is a breath of fresh air in the speculative fiction world, in the dystopian fiction world, whatever we want to call it. Because a lot of the time when I look at those genres, they struggle in terms of style. They fall flat on their face. I will just say it. There are some apexes. I got the Book of the New Sun over here by Gene Wolfe. I can go on and on about sci-fi series and fantasy series that are absolutely amazing. But in a genre that isn't necessarily based on style or uses it as a marker as much as when we are maybe ranking literary fiction, the style sometimes goes by the wayside for the story in speculative and science fiction novels like The Road. And having someone, and this was so cool, like McCarthy, even if it was a novel he finished in a really fast amount of time, get into the scene, I feel like changed everything. Because when this came out, the sci-fi nerds went crazy. They were saying like, you've taken up the space, you won the Pulitzer Prize for this, you've sucked up the vacuum of science fiction sales and all this stuff, and all these other people deserve it more, and yada yada yada. It was really funny to kind of watch all that go down. But while they were tinkering with their little character diagrams and character building sheets, McCarthy was studying the Oxford English Dictionary. He was learning that words have an innate power to them, like Carl Jung knew that words like fire and snap and crackle, like all that, the words sound like the image that they are portraying in a very odd way. And McCarthy in The Road, when he says things like autistic darkness and all the other random things that he says, just shows what true craft looks like. And so first and foremost, that's why The Road is really good, because in sci-fi and fantasy, there's great world building, there's some great prose sometimes, but great style is somewhat hard to find, especially style that's connected to the earth. Like I'm not saying there aren't technical writers and writers who study sentence structure, but one of the things that McCarthy does so well is he roots everything back to the earth. But in this novel, it's to this apocalyptic world. But the weaving in of flashbacks in the old world and the relationship with his wife, or him fishing with his father, and all that image patterning kind of moves throughout the entire novel in a really good way that grounds us in this world. And that's what makes it, and for, I would say, a more serious reader, that's what elevates this beyond just being boring between the crazy moments, between, when there's a gunfight or they're running away or something crazy is happening. What's there in the middle? And it's a rumination on God. It's a contemplation of being a father and on love and on what it means to be a good human. And that's something that McCarthy actually cares about a lot. He talks about, Heidegger not caring about the soul at all, even though he was writing, one could say, more esoteric stuff with ontology and phenomenology and stuff. But Wittgenstein, who was more into the philosophy of language and into math and all this stuff, he cared more about the soul than Heidegger did. And McCarthy has said about literature, which, signals that he is into transformative writing. What's the point of philosophy? What's the point of poetry? What's the point of literature unless it's going to make you a better person? Honestly. Is it so that you can hit your artistic apex? I just have to do this. It's an impulse from my soul. If I don't write, if I don't do this, like, you're going to give me that little cliche, or are you going to tell me it's all just about making someone's day better? Or are you going to man up or woman up and say, I have this talent, I have this God-given talent and this opportunity to have the time, the tens of thousands of hours to do something important, and am I going to do something with it? Because you consciously create transformative pieces of work. I just talked to John Pastelli, who wrote a modern masterpiece that came out this year, a novel titled Major Arcana, and I point blank asked him, you consciously made this transformative, right? Like, it's entertaining. Writing something entertaining is a million times easier than writing something transformative. So yes, this is a very entertaining novel that's paced well, like The Road, but you knew and consciously made this touch my soul, right? And he said yes. And any other author that isn't trying to do this, David Lynch, it's all in the unconscious, and David Lynch would write all of his scripts and have it all down, then just add unconscious things on the set, which is fine, and that's what happens in revision and in first drafts anyway. Unless someone is lying to you, that's what happens. You consciously sit down and exert your talent and your time to create something beautiful. And so it's interesting that at the end of McCarthy's career, he wrote something that was more direct about being good and what being good actually means, what being moral means. You know, something McCarthy, when you look at his interviews, talks about morality a lot. And, you know, that's maybe because he, in his opinion, did some things like with his first wife and all this stuff that he felt like was immoral. Maybe he made these bad decisions and wasn't the greatest person, but it's sometimes those types of people who we need to contemplate this stuff in this world where people can't even get behind objective morality, can't get behind a basic set of codes. Because, oh my God, that doesn't exist. What about this situation? What about that? We can't even get behind. We can't even pull it together and teach with the $120,000 we put into each people in the United States, the golden rule of do no harm, keep your hands to yourself. We can't even do that. And there's the only improvements on that front are that people are becoming more and more insular because of technology and bad food and the systematic abuse from technology at some level, that they are more sheltered. So yes, less abusive. That's not a win. We should be activated, energized, have aggression in our bodies, and be able to control ourselves. And, you know, peace in our bodies all at once, and not need to do that because we are connected to higher values and these types of things. And the lower class, I want to say the lower classes, people who don't think, which is all classes, people in all classes, in general, if something goes wrong, will automatically default to having no values because they have no values in their own life. You know, I remember a long time ago, I knew this Christian guy, and he was like being all pious and all this stuff, but underneath all that, just he wasn't stable, and that's basically everyone. And one time I showed him the tenets of Satanism and didn't tell him that, like the Church of Satan. And I asked him, like, hey, do you believe in this? Do you believe in that? Which mostly were about like self-preservation and stuff like that. He agreed with all of them. And then later on, we were at an event and he felt disrespected by some person who wasn't disrespecting him, like in actuality, and he tried to fight this guy. But this is some dude who came off as this person who's into all, and it's just, that's our society. And we are doing nothing to train ourselves to become objectively moral. So if something like this happens, we can maybe come together and not cannibalize each other. And I know this is an extreme scenario and you can't necessarily prepare for that. But we have an opportunity as in the United States, as the most wealthy country in the world, with a very literate population. You know, we're not the most intelligent country, but we have a lot of money and most people are somewhat literate to do this. And we have totally fallen off that bandwagon because if we as a people could hold objective values and ideals in our hearts and, you know, fail at times, but in general, hold to those and up not just the standard of like not hurting people or, you know, directly stealing, but not like exploiting people and exploiting the earth and stuff like that, we would almost, the entire system of government would have to change because most of it would be unnecessary. Police departments, all this stuff would basically go by the wayside. There is an inherent economic complex that's much bigger. We talk about the military industrial complex. There is a complex in the United States that wants to prevent us from actually waking up and becoming better individuals and becoming moral individuals, not because of something like this happening so that we all just don't eat each other alive, because all the pensions, all the programs would disappear. Because it's not just that we would become better people, we would be more economically, or I should say we would have a higher GDP, because when people aren't rooted in direct fear, especially at the managerial and creative class level, if we have more people in an expansive and creative and supportive society, there would be more innovation. And so that's why this novel is really beautiful to me, because it really shows that. It's a very direct showing of like, and it's not like, hey, you need to go become a prepper or something like that. And maybe you feel that way after you read this, like, damn, like I'm not prepared enough for something like this. But rather, if there was even a minor incident in the United States, we would turn on each other. We would be snitching each other out. We would be the government's lapdogs. we would go against our own morals and all this stuff. And so when you ask, what is modern literature supposed to do? What's the literary renaissance about? That's what it's about. It's not just about getting people to read. What's reading about? Why? What happened when you became a free thinker? That's why I don't like logic bros. That's why I don't like little nihilist cucks. One that because they're not trustworthy citizens. They're not doing anything. At least a lot of the time. Isn't that why you are different than the kid or the young man who didn't read? You're now how are you stronger? It's not just that you know more. This isn't just about a circle jerk for us to talk about our interests. Oh, have you read Schelling? Yes, I've read Schelling. Have you read fiction? No, I haven't read it. Oh, you need to read fiction. That's not what this is about. It's about opening people up to the path of self-education and deeper interiority and knowledge and letting them go take their own path. It's not about being cult leaders or having a cult of personality, but rather saying, okay, you like this and look at all this other stuff you can go to and explore in the world of physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual learning. It's about making people curious. And so The Road does a really great job at that, honestly. Maybe more so than a lot of McCarthy's novels, it really makes you think about these things. And that's really important. In terms of length, in terms of style, in terms of pacing, in terms of ambition, though, as a literary novel, it falls a little bit flat for me. And this list would look different if it was a first-time reader Cormac McCarthy ranking list. This one I think is up there pretty high. That kind of hits you. But I've read this one a lot with my classes and read it out loud, which is like a pretty deep study into a book when you read an entire book out loud from front to back yourself. And I've done that multiple times with this one, and I've found a lot of things that make me cry and that are really deep and really good. And it's a very accessible novel, but through further rereading, many of his other works I think are just much, much better. And with a little bit of research or contemplation, you can kind of get to a deeper spot other than we all need to be good people, because we heard that you heard that in elementary school, right? And this is a very visceral example that really makes you want to believe that and maybe figure that out. But what does that mean, and how do we accomplish that in this screwed up world? In the screwed up world of The Road, there's you just don't do it. You just don't eat people and you starve to death. But in many of McCarthy's other novels, he has characters who are exploring this and working through that, and that's how it looks like for us, and that's what's important, right? What does this look like? Because many of us are, we're fallen beings. Even if you're not a Christian, I'm not a Christian. Love Christianity, and theology though. And if you look at any religion, any whatever, they all believe that we are kind of this fallen being, that we at some point were at a higher level and fell off of that, whether that was just a pure state as an animal or whatever, or before the virus of language or whatever entered our mind. We've fallen as beings and we're troubled. And in this technological and insane world, it's easier with all the vices and pathways of exploitation and self-preservation and focus on the self to get sucked into all that, into the illusion of Maya or whatever, of samsara. But how do we deal with that? And that's what other Cormac McCarthy novels deal with, which is one of the reasons why I love him. That's kind of the meat and potatoes of literature. That's why, a lot of these books deal with that type of stuff. And that's what's sad about the world we're in right now and the loss of literature, is that we have so many new things that we have to deal with, and we don't have maybe some of the tools. Major Arcana, this novel I was just talking about, is really cool because it deals with the internet. It deals with people on the internet in a really, really cool way. And people who've been consumed by the internet. And that's many of us. And we don't have literature from these great writers, or at least not enough of them, kind of talking about our experience and the new reality we're in. And so, that's what the literary renaissance is about. It's about getting this new inflow of information to help give us modern individuals representation, not just in the artistic world, but in the moral world, in the world of the soul, the mapping out of the soul. That's what the novel has done all throughout time. It's mapped out our biggest problems. The novel is the greatest medium of interiority. And so what's more interior than wasting your life away on these apps that are totally catered to you, that are built, making you feel a certain way and keeping you on. My wife's like, why do they always show me some video? I'll be having a good time on, Reels or something. And then there's a video of a puppy dying or something. So I'm like, that's what keeps you on. It's the anchor on the other side that makes you sad. And then your body knows it's coming. Then you're happy for a while. Then they show you something about, some kid who died from leukemia or something at the age of 2. And it's like, oh my God, of course, that's so sad. What's that experience look like? A movie can't show that. A TV show can't show that. An album can't show that. A novel can show that, though. And contemplating that stuff, that's one of the problems that we're facing right now that makes us, I feel like, worse individuals. Too much, addiction to technology. That's what's going to help us, ground ourselves and become better. And so anyway, The Road is a great novel to kind of start this process. It's a good novel to give to anybody. Like my mom's read it, my dad's read it, my sister's read it, all my students, generally liked it. And so it's a place to open up these ideas about being a good person and then carrying the fire. But as I said, that's not enough, but this is a novel on the pathway to deeper contemplations of that. And when we're talking about some of the top McCarthy novel and some of the other novels we're going to be getting to in a second, that's where the meat and potatoes kind of get into it, right? Like that's what it's about. And so let's now move on. So on our list right now, we have The Road at 10, we have Child of God at 11, we have Outer Dark at 7, The Crossing at 2, and Blood Meridian at 3. And so next we have No Country for Old Men. And something I should talk about really fast is that Cormac McCarthy was a huge fan of Gnosticism. And The Road, one of the cooler elements of it, once you read through McCarthy, and especially if you start to learn about Gnosticism, and you don't need some crazy knowledge of it, but just the general principles, and then observing it through his works. And, I talk about it a lot on the Cormac McCarthy course. I'm trying to do a Gnostic interpretation of every one of his novels. There are books on it. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. The Road is like the apocalyptic final event in that kind of series. It's like pure entropy, but also in a world filled with total evil, the total demiurgic reality. There's still hope in there. And so really cool stuff. But No Country. So speaking of Gnosticism, though, coming in at number 8 on our ranking list is McCarthy's novel No Country for Old Men, which of course was turned into a awesome movie by the Coen brothers that really put McCarthy on the scene back in the mid 2000s at a totally different level than just being kind of this literary bad boy. Then he was suddenly the literary superstar. The millions really started rolling in after this one. And so one of the things that is unfortunate about this novel and about even The Road and some of the adaptions of McCarthy, even in all the Pretty Horses, the Child of God adaptation. I'm afraid that the Blood Meridian adaptation and the Outer Dark adaptation will do this. Actually, there's going to be an adaptation of The Passenger by Andrew Nichols, which I feel like isn't going to do this. So McCarthy's work, as maybe you're hearing me talk about slowly throughout this presentation, definitely has a very spiritual dimension to it. He really cares about spirituality and layering that in. And it's not like this new age spirituality bullshit that that you think of when I say the word spirituality. It's this almost perennial philosophy that encompasses all the different religions, and not just the light sides, but actually more so like the dark sides of it. And so in the movie, the hyper-rational elements of the novel were shown. So McCarthy loves this exploration of hyper-rationality. Judge Holden, hyper-rational. Anton Chigurh, hyper-rational. And Alicia Western, hyper-rational. And this connects to his interest in science, in scientific materialism, this kind of weird thing that he started to experience when he started to meet people in the science world. Because many of us are pop scientists, right? Like we love to learn about quantum physics and some of these things, and even maybe do some math and contemplate some of these ideas, but we're not in the game. And if you know someone who is it's a stereotype, but it's true. Like if you know the engineer, if you know the coder, if you know the mathematician or the scientist type, the people that are really deep in it, not just I got a bachelor's degree in computer science and, code at my job type, but people who are really in it, been in it for life and deep, they have that sense of detachment, right? I mean, these are the people that are creating these social media platforms that are ruining society and all this stuff, right? They are very detached. One could say evil, nihilistic, all of this stuff. Have this utopian, odd worldview, the Peter Thiels, all this craziness, right? And we have all met these people at the more macro level, right? Like this dude, the engineer that's detached. But like I said, there's levels to the game. And so when McCarthy got into this world of science, met these people at the Santa Fe Institute, started to meet people at the MacArthur Fellowship, which happened before he published Blood Meridian. And he met people like Murray Gell-Mann and Nobel Prize winners, all these people. Well, you're going to be exposed to some of these ideas that some of these people have. Suddenly you start working into eugenics and all this other stuff, some of this more scary stuff. And it all stems from this hyper-rationality, the rationale and logic kind of going way too far. And so many of McCarthy's novels are actually a battle against that. We have the kid resisting the judge's hyper-rationality, trying to turn the entire world into a simulacra in his journal, but also as the demiurge or an archon. He tries to resist that, most likely failing or joining him at the end, depending on how you feel about that. In No Country for Old Men, we have the spiritual war happening with Chigger, who is this hitman, this hyper-rational demiurgic archon, and then Belle, who's ruminating about the past and about morality and all this stuff. And then in The Passenger, we have Alicia Western, and she's really kind of grappling with herself and this scientific talent and path that she took early in her life, and now is like kind of having to deal with it, this hyper-rational side of herself that's driving her towards suicide. So McCarthy loves these wars because I think this stems from a war that he had within himself. That here he is, it's Cormac McCarthy, the artist, right? As I talked about earlier, it's Cormac McCarthy, the guy who is being a sad boy in his journals and is so mad that his dad, he decides to rebuke him and become a novelist and write about him multiple times. That's a sensitive individual. Cormac McCarthy, I know none of you guys believe in astrology, but he was a Cancer, which is like the most emotional sun sign. And even if you don't believe in it, McCarthy is very, very sentimental. Listen, go read his love letters to the 16-year-old Augusta Britt. You know, he's being very sentimental. And from what Vincenzo Barney said about the ones that haven't been released, they're very gushy. So he isn't some hard-nosed dude like we were programmed to see in media. He was someone experiencing this in his own soul, you know, wanting to be this egotistical dude who's into science, trying to be the best, right? Who's into the young girls and all this stuff, but also this more sensitive artist side who's wants to be a father, who's sad that he couldn't be a father to his first son, who cares about the world, who cares about these things, who cares about people. You know, McCarthy is at his core someone who actually cares about the lower class, the disenfranchised. That's why he features so many of them in his novels. And so there's this spiritual battle going on in No Country for Old Men. And in the movies, that's flattened. In all of the McCarthy adaptions, it's been flattened. Because if you read the novel, you know, No Country for Old Men, Sheriff Bell and his rumination, the italicized scenes, have a much bigger part. Like I know in the movie, there's a cut scene and a compilation as Bell's speaking over, you know, reading, you know, text from the book. But there's a lot more than that in this text. So the movie runs as a thriller, right? Like you're caught up in it immediately. It opens up with Chigger, you know, capping people and Llewellyn with the money and all that. But at the start of No Country for Old Men, it reads like an elegy. It is, if you listen to the narration of it, it has a mix of humility. There's all this memory within. There's confusion in the novel. There's a meditation on what? Yes, the West's dying moral order. And the actuality of what's happening in the book that we don't get. So in the movie, we more get this analysis that, hey, we've failed to uphold this. Like it's a no country for old men, right? Like this, the cartels, all this stuff has kind of reached this point where it's now we're not able to control it. But in the text, it actually more reads that in this world of evil, in this Gnostic archonic world, whatever we want to call it, even if it's not that, it's not that Bell is a failure or that the law has failed, but rather that in this world there is no law. That in this fallen cosmos, in this fallen world that has now gone technological, that's post-nuclear atomic bomb being dropped, all this stuff, the law has nothing. And so Bell, realizing this, is a seeker. He's a spiritual seeker working through that. This new world, this new alien world that he's in, that and he says it's not what you expected, you know, it's not what you expect. He's still trying to move through it. And so Bell, in his weakness, is actually finding a spiritual path. And the way he finds that is through compassion, is through love. And that's what the dream scenes layer in. And so this is actually the anchor. So on one side, we have Bell and his compassion and his love in this fallen world. But on the other, and him being a seeker, which the movie doesn't really show. It just shows him as this sheriff who's kind of in over his head. And we get some of these dream scenes that sound nice and all this stuff. And I'm not saying that the movie's bad. And I'm not saying that if this got implemented into the movie, it wouldn't win an Academy Award, right? It would turn it more into like the more artistic type film, more of a direct representation of the text. And when you read the No Country for Old Men screenplay, which I have in the Cormac McCarthy archive, it reads less like an elegy and more like a thriller. I mean, there's still a lot of stuff with Bell, But a lot of that stuff is stuff that McCarthy added later, which I think was more of a reflection on his own old age, right? Like stuff that he was personally going through. And so, but that's still important though. Like it's an updated text technically. And like I said, we're talking about the book and not talking about the movie, but there are some of you guys listening who haven't read this but saw the movie. And there are many people, unfortunately, also who were primed by the movie and then when reading the book are seeing the characters in that manner and maybe missing some of this stuff. And so in the novel also, the drug deals, all these things, they feel like realist events, right? This is what happens in Mexico. But if you look at the McCarthy's Western Quintet, so I believe that if you look back and it's actually in order, and technically there's a sixth piece too with the counselor. So we have Blood Meridian, detailing the 1800s and like the evil there and the metaphysical battle happening there. Then we have the Border Trilogy talking about this metaphysical battle and this nostalgia and these young men in this middle zone in the 1940s and 50s when the world is changing and the old world is basically being locked away forever. Then we have the 1980s where cartel violence really starts to come in and Mexico and the border turns into what we conceptualize it now. And then in the counselor, his sixth Western piece, he basically shows us like what it's turned into with the greed and the snuff films and all of this stuff. But it's actually all detailing in this metaphysical battle with evil. And that's most apparent in All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, and Blood Meridian. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't continue in No Country for Old Men, because like I just said, he wrote this as he was writing the Border Trilogy and Blood Meridian. It was in that same 5 or 6 year phase when he did all that, and this is what he was believing in. This was right after the Nag Hammadi library, the Gnostic Bibles, were translated and released in English for the first time. And McCarthy, who mentions the word Gnostic in his work Outer Dark before that came out, knew about Gnosticism, had read Hans Jonas's The Gnostic Religion before all this. So when the Nag Hammadi library came out, as someone who has read by the end of his life and owned over 20,000 books, of course that was a big deal. It was actually a big deal in the New York Times and stuff. So McCarthy knew and most likely read the Nag Hammadi library and then was influenced by Gnosticism for all these works in this period, which, like I said, include all these works that were later adapted into novels, but that core of it is still there. And so the metaphysical question of this novel is this work the creation of a God that is good or a fallen one? And what does it mean for us to be awakened and be spiritual seekers in this world? Because if you remember this novel, if you don't know, this novel begins with Bell talking about this guy who's going to the electric chair. And the kid knows that he's been planning to kill someone his entire life and he's going to go to hell. And the boy talks about not believing in the existence of a soul. And this is the new evil that McCarthy's talking about here. Because when you read Dostoevsky, when you read Ivan in the Grand Inquisitor section, when you read Milton or Dante, they're rebelling against the divine order. There's a rebellion, but they believe in it. They're grappling with it. But this novel and many new novels and this world we're living in, as I just was talking about, rejects the idea of transcendent law itself. And this is why Bell says, when I saw that, I was wondering if it made me think that there's a new kind on the block, and that's foreshadowing Chigurh. And that's why Chigurh in this novel is post-metaphysics. Because what is post-metaphysics? Well, metaphysics, it's probability, right? It's what our world runs on, economic forecasting. Like my dad was a professor of statistics. I wish he was here. He's got jokes all day about this stuff. He said, I have the best job at the university because I don't, and you do private consulting too. I don't have to get my answers right when you do statistical forecasting. I'm just get to be wrong. And so when we look at the judge, though, the Judge Holden in Blood Meridian, he's a craftsman of war. He is the god of war, right? That's what he's believing in the world. But Chigurh is the god of chance. That's what he's crafting into the world. And that's an even scarier possibility. That's what's built, the algorithms, stats and chance and all this. We think that war is bad. This hellscape we're in right now is because of probability and stats and big data, which is all built on chance. And so it's interesting when Chigurh tells people, he flips a coin in this novel and tells people the coin doesn't have a say, right? It's just you. But by abdicating that, he moves away from the judge. The judge takes responsibility, right? He kills people. He'll tell you why. It's war. It's all this ideal stuff. But now this is our world. We no longer have a personality behind anything. We have a system, right? We have an algorithm, and that's a million times scarier. It's a million times scarier when someone with these order followers with masks show up and kill you or throw you in prison or whatever. And they just listen. It's a system now. That's what it's called, the control system. That is a metaphysical de-evolution. I would rather live in a world with people who are fighting for, these reasons and killing me than being slowly killed by this, this algorithm, this system. Because there is no breaking free. When you're in the system, there's no way out. And that's where we're at right now. That's what created the new evil. We're locked into this world now. There is no more freedom. That's what the Border Trilogy explores. A last hurrah and a last journey into that freedom. And so, all that to say, that that No Country for Old Men is a really good novel. It's better than The Road. It's better than Child of God. It struggles at times, I would say, because it is a thriller novel. It does focus on these things, even though I just gassed all this stuff up that I'm talking about. Like, it is somewhat muted in the text. It's not as strong as some of the other things. The prose, a lot of the problem is with this one that, you look at Blood Meridian, it's got this apocalyptic violence. You look at the Border Trilogy, they're working within mountains and stuff. In these beautiful settings. But in this novel, they're on the borderlands. And if anyone's ever been to the border, I lived 30 minutes from the border when I was in Arizona. I've been to the border in New Mexico and Texas before. A lot of it's just pretty bleak out there. Sonora and the Chihuahuan Desert, for a lot of it, especially near the border, is just desert. And not even nice desert with like saguaros. It's like just fucking shrubs. But McCarthy writes about this. He doesn't write about nature as much in this. He rather transplants us into motels and, these different locations and these different places that is a different type of writing for McCarthy. It's a little bit modern. And so I think that he captures all that really well, but I think that McCarthy functions a lot better when he's talking about the other stuff. He does that more in The Passenger, which also takes place in 1980. And I think that works to a better strength. And so the style isn't as strong. The story is strong, but I feel like doesn't have as many transformative elements in it. It's not as ambitious as many of his other novels. And so I think on a first read, this is a great read to get into McCarthy. There's some cool stuff because it's McCarthy writing about the modern world, which is awesome. But I think it falls flat in some of this other stuff because the scope and symbolic ambition is a little bit less. Like, I kind of gave you guys all the cookies right there. But, in some of these other novels, like we're going to talk about The Orchard Keeper in a minute. I did a 10-hour course on The Orchard Keeper, you guys. Like, I don't think I could do a 10-hour course on this. Like, I know Wendy Gooden tried, but he was just talking about fucking Judge Holden Chigger being, Chigger bad, like not that level of like spiritual analysis. Like, I just gave more than he did in a 5-hour video. He was more just covering plot points. But in my Orchard Keeper course, like, I maybe out of those 10 hours, there's an hour of plot and 9 hours of like analysis. And so, the better McCarthy novels, I feel like, make you able to do that. And once again, that requires rereading, which, most people don't do. Everyone just wants to check off the next book. Everybody wants to say, yeah, have you read Anna Karenina? Yeah, I've read Anna Karenina. Have you read A Confession, though? Have you read this? Have you read A Confederacy of the Dunces? No? Oh, you need to read that. Like, it feels, I get it. We live in this odd world where it feels like you need to be more well-read than you actually need to be. And you hear people like me up here talking and recalling all these books, but guess what, you guys? This is my job. When I was 13, I wanted to be a writer. When I was 19, I thought like, damn, I want to be a professor, but like, I don't want to be a professor. That sucks. And so what does that look like, right? And so anyway, so you don't need to be ambitious. The best thing you can do is know a couple novels, to know a couple novels really well. And then you can go read a lot of novels. And then you can find novels you want to reread and add them to the list. That's definitely the most valuable thing that I've done in my career as a reader, is like taking rereading seriously. And so, boom, there you go. That's why. So there's my ranking on this one, coming in at number 9. So next up, we have a book that's going to make everyone click off and skip ahead, but it's The Orchard Keeper. And let me make a plea to each one of you guys right now. So this is coming in on my list at number 6, which is pretty high. This is McCarthy's least read novel by far. And it's because it's a hard novel to read. So when McCarthy first wrote this, as I was talking about earlier, he was a savant. McCarthy knew that he had skill. McCarthy knew that he could write something sick. And in the first draft of this that he first sent to Random House and made it through the slush pile, he was doing crazy things. He was working at that technical level where it's too hard for the modern reader. He was doing things and pushing himself to a level with layering that Albert Erskine, who was Faulkner's editor, said like, hey, bro, we're going to have to pull you back here. And like I said, McCarthy almost said, let's scrap the deal altogether. You either publish it as it is or not at all. But I think he wanted the money a little bit more and obviously to get the deal. But nonetheless, The Orchard Keeper is a great novel. It requires a lot of work. It is written in a manner. McCarthy was, there's other McCarthy scholars that irk when I say this, but they're wrong. McCarthy was a postmodernist author, among many things else. He was also a Western author, also a Southern Gothic author, also tapping into modernism and these things. But he incorporated, so when he started to write, this is when Nabokov is going on his run and writing Lolita and Pin and Speak Memory and the other one. This is when postmodernism is starting to pop off. He's writing this in the early 60s. And so at this point in literature, framing was a really big thing. And so something that McCarthy does in Outer Dark is he frames the entire novel as someone's nightmare. In this, he frames it as a recollection of a memory. Blood Meridian has postmodernist, insane elements to it. Sutree is a wild ride with so many characters and framing devices. Child of the God is very progressive with its necrophilia, especially for the time. He was into progressive ideas as a writer and pushing the envelope, which at that time would throw him in the postmodernist group. But he isn't like Thomas Pynchon. He's not writing about all these different things and doing it in that manner. But actually, when you look at like The Passenger, that's a kind of a postmodernist novel too. But this novel is hard to read because it is a recollection of a memory. And so it reads like a fever dream. There's haziness to it, especially at the start. Like, I remember as I was rereading this, like I had to sit in the course and explain so many times, this is how this car accident happened. The first time I read this, I was reading and I was like, did someone just take their car off the road and crash into a river? Did someone just die? Like, there was all this stuff going on, but it was written in such an odd way that it was hard to understand. I know this with my friends who are musicians. So I have a friend who's a musician and he's absolutely spectacular. He's been playing since he was like 4, and plays 10 different instruments, like really, really good, right? And he plays in a band and stuff. But when he first got into music at like 18, he was like playing this stuff and no bands wanted him because he was playing stuff that was so high level that it didn't sound good. Right? He was playing music for like musicians, like doing all this technical stuff. But if you were at a bar with 100 people watching and they're the opener, you're going to be like, what? Like, it doesn't like sound right, like in terms of melody. And that's what happened with McCarthy in this novel. He basically went all the way with this one. He did all these tricks, all these framing devices. He writes in a more aggressive manner. He uses dozens of semicolons in this novel. He is more personal with this novel. He's like talking about like witch covens and like there's like folklore in this novel. It's very Faulknerian. Like, he's really kind of putting himself out there. And I think it's actually it's wrong to call it is derivative of Faulkner, but something being derivative doesn't mean it's bad. Everything is derivative of something. Nothing is innovative. And this is innovative in its own sense. And so this novel is about this novel is a rebuke against his father in the strongest possible way. This novel is about eminent domain. This novel is about the changing world. This novel is about 3 different characters. One, Arthur Omby, who was born in like the 1860s. Who is the old world, right? And this novel takes place in like the 1940s or 30s, if I remember correctly. So Omby maybe was even older, but Omby in this novel is like in his 80s or 90s. So he's this really old dude from the old South. There's another guy named Marion Silder who's like in his mid 20s and he is in the middle zone, right? He is a whiskey bootlegger. He is of the world and he has a muscle car, but he also understands the old world. He likes to hunt. He was raised in this kind of world without technology and all this. Then there's a young boy, John Wesley Ratner, and he's of the old world, but the new world, but he wants to be a part of the old world. He doesn't like this new world. And it's this novel of, it's this tragedy of showing these characters trying to interact with this new world that we're all, that's coming. Because in Appalachia, so something that's interesting is that Appalachia was developed rapidly because more rapidly than almost anywhere in the United States, in the sense that in the early, like the 1920s, 1930s, it hadn't been touched yet. A lot of that area wasn't industrialized. Like there was coal mining and stuff, but a lot of it wasn't industrialized. And when you look at like the Northeast, it was industrialized. When you look at like California and some of these areas, they were industrialized. And when you look at the West, they didn't have multi-generational people there. But in Tennessee, where McCarthy was from, there were people that had been there hundreds of years and they hadn't been like kicked out because of the government and eminent domain and big projects yet. Big industry hadn't moved in yet, right? And so suddenly there were people who were living without titles on land for 100+ years on this family land. And suddenly all that ended in a decade or two. It was almost like Japan, how Japan did this quick industrial revolution. That's what happened in Knoxville, and McCarthy's father was the leader of that. So McCarthy's father was the valedictorian of the Yale Law School and was hired by the state of Tennessee to come into that area and clear everyone out through eminent domain to create the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and all these huge dam projects where like people's lands were going to be flooded and not viable anymore, or like, farmland and stuff wasn't going to be viable. And so thousands of people got the letter from Charles McCarthy saying, you got to get off the land, right? That's a very intense thing. So McCarthy's family was the uppity folks. They lived kind of out in the country, not in Knoxville proper, but a little bit south of it. And if you guys want to go see the Orchard Keeper course, I actually show an entire map of the novel, like all the points on the map, and we do Google Street View and stuff. It's really cool. I studied it and asked questions and emailed people and got all this information about basically all the locations of the novel. And so this is a novel of McCarthy's childhood. Like literally, this is where McCarthy, like where the orchard is in the novel is where McCarthy was playing, like where people lived. It was like right where he would go walk to and do stuff at. It's right where, and so McCarthy was there. And he was born into this. His family were the outsiders from Rhode Island, from these elite universities who were raising this elite family. And they were the people knocking people off their land. What's worse than that? I mean, he's not the police officer. He's the head dude telling the police to come to your house. And so McCarthy his father, though, was apparently abusive and was very busy. And so McCarthy had these habits and these hobbies where he would go out into the world and just spend all of his time wandering. So he would just go out into the world. And this is what he says. He would just wander all day and all night. He would barely sleep. And so on those journeys, he started to talk to people, though. He started to meet people that weren't these uppity people in his family, but rather people who were former slaves or family, literally. If you were born in 1860, you were only 70 years old 75 years old, or 80 years old when McCarthy was walking around. There were people who were alive, or there were plenty of people who knew former slaves or were, in that thing. Even though Knoxville was surprisingly, it actually wasn't a big area for slavery. That county rejected siding with both the North and the South because it really didn't, because of the ecosystem there and stuff, and because there weren't like these big plantation farms, because it wasn't possible on that land. Like slavery didn't take hold in a big way like many of the southern states or other parts of Tennessee. But nonetheless, McCarthy met this old world. He met the people his father was kicking off their land, even if it wasn't their land, but like the type of people. And he fell in love with them. He had an affinity with them, and that's why we hear about them so much in his Southern Gothic novels. And in this novel, he realized what government incursion does to people. And so that's what the Orchard Keeper is about. It's about 3 different layers of government interference. And it's tragic. It causes mania. I mean, it's a wild novel, you guys. And so that's the framing that you need to read this through to really kind of get this. So this is McCarthy being very personal about his life, writing about these locations, writing about these people that he knows, and writing in a more direct way about nature than any other novel. In this novel, he creates a direct line to nature and the human soul and to karma. He creates a system of reciprocity in this novel that he hides in the rest of his works. That through the destruction of nature, we're destroying the soul, and those who destroy nature personally are having their own soul destroyed, and that's how he views his father. And he shows that through these characters. I mean, it's really good stuff. I mean, man, I think I'm not spoiling stuff in this video, or at least haven't tried to spoil too much. And so I'm not going to give away all the meat and potatoes to you guys, but man, oh man, this one is going to take you another read. And like I said, when you first read it, it will most likely be your least favorite McCarthy novel. When you compare it to very, very accessible novels like The Orchard Keeper, The Road and Child of God, you're going to be like, damn, this was a lot. But if you are a fan of McCarthy and you really want to tap into who he was as a person and really tap into this idea of how civilization ruined our society, like ruined a lot of this honor code stuff I was talking about earlier, and nature and our connection to nature and all this beautiful stuff, this novel is very direct about it. And does a lot of unconscious indirect layering also, but it's really good stuff. And so when you get to this, if you're struggling, like I said, I have a 10-hour course that will walk you through. You just put if you have the Substack app, you can just put the audio on. You don't even have to watch me unless I'm doing my video map tours. But yeah, like I said, I have a soft spot in my heart for this one, but I honestly do think that it packs a huge punch, especially with the characters, like the characters and the characterization and some of the lines in this one, like there are no more heroes. Like it really gets into McCarthy's philosophy and basically sets up everything else he does in these other novels. Like you basically see the template that he follows, and the italicized scenes, absolutely wonderful. Like you get to see McCarthy raw. I mean, the scene at the start, like the novel opens and it's the prologue, so I'm not really spoiling here. but it opens with a bunch of dudes trying to saw down a tree in a cemetery, and there's a bar that's grown through the middle of the tree. It's like the ultimate machine in the garden metaphor that like he builds throughout the entire novel. So just really wonderful stuff, you guys. Like on point for sure by McCarthy. And so I recommend this one 100%. And it comes in, like I said, at 6th place. It comes in over novels we've talked about like Outer Dark, No Country for Old Men, The Road, Child of God. And so if you like those, this is going to require this much more effort. Well, this much more effort. So rounding out the bottom of the pack, we have everything from 6 through 11 covered right now, but we do not have number 8 on the list. And so coming in at 8th place, and this is honestly really hard. So let me just say that this could be easily above, like between Cities of the Plain, Outer Dark, and The Orchard Keeper, this was the hardest ordering for me. I feel like there is a first tier of McCarthy novels. Like the first 5 are like tier 1. There's a second tier that includes Cities of the Plain, The Orchard Keeper, and Outer Dark. And then there's the third tier with No Country for Old Men, The Road, and Child of God. And so in this second tier, I feel like within any of these tiers, I could see you ordering them however you want. That's really personal preference. But I really do feel like, it's going to be a hard day out for you if you're going to argue that Cities of the Plain belongs in the first tier with like The Passenger and all the Pretty Horses. Because this, and so let's talk about this novel. So I think this could have been really good. I think this could have been McCarthy's greatest work. Honestly, I think it should have been McCarthy's greatest work. But we got it at a time when McCarthy was a multimillionaire. He was famous. He had the girlfriend in her early 20s. It's a whole thing, right? And so when you're sleeping in the silk sheets and you've made it, you're finally there, you've shipped all these girls off to Mexico and done all this, well, you might not need to put as much effort in. And so McCarthy wrote Cities of the Plain, the screenplay, in the late 1970s and finished it and actually worked on it and thought that it should have been, turned into a movie and all this stuff. And so he had the template of the screenplay. And much like No Country for Old Men, he just adapted his own screenplay into a novel. And so he had been practicing. He had written All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing, these prequels for these characters that he talks about in Cities of the Plain. So he's in the mode. And so that's why it's better than like a No Country for Old Men. He's in the mood of writing about these kids because he has been and he cares about them. But he basically, for the first 80% of this novel, he basically transplants what happens in the screenplay. And so he adds some fluff to it, makes it nice, adds the nature stuff, there's all this stuff going on there and it makes it really great. But the problem is that All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing were these original creations. They were McCarthy actually trying and actually really kind of coming out. And you can see it because the last 20% of the novel, which isn't in the screenplay, is McCarthy writing something original and caring about it. And it's actually where McCarthy gets the most personal about his characters and like brings them into the modern world. It's the most, Cities of the Plain, the ending is the most emotional, heart-wrenching thing of any McCarthy novel. It actually goes metafictional. It's really crazy. It's the ultimate conclusion of everything he explores in regard to God and life in the first 2 novels of the Border Trilogy. He could have ended his career with this. We don't need No Country for Old Men or The Road. I feel like The Passenger does kind of build on what's happening here, in a sense. But his career could have ended with that last 20%. And that last 20%, like I said, amazing. It's also an awesome novel because we get to see characters in a series that we got to know in the prequels finally come together. And that doesn't happen in any other McCarthy novel, right? There is no other kind of sequential books or any other characters that make appearances in other novels. And so there is a power to this novel. I just feel like a lot of the things that make All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing good in that middle zone, the romanticism, the journey, the love angle, the talk about God with all these other random people, the dreams, many of this stuff isn't really there. And the core plot of this novel doesn't really kind of turn up until the end. And so it's really good, like really, really good. Like we just reread this for the book club probably 5 months ago, and I had reread The Crossing and All the Pretty Horses a lot, and I've read this one a couple times also, well, a lot, but it had been at like 2 or 3 years since I read this, and I was like, damn, this is really good. Because I always read, like I said, the last 20%. I've read that a lot, actually, because it's so important to understand what McCarthy thinks of the afterlife in the modern world and so much. And so that's worth the price of admission alone, everyone. Everything I'm saying about the ending. And so it's a perfect way, a perfect capstone to this series. And that's how it usually is. Either the ending of a series is not as good as the start, or it's way better. And so this one falls off a little bit, but then at the end really peaks up. And so Now we only have 3 novels left, everyone. And then when we're done with that, I'll rank and talk about the screenplays, his unpublished work, his nonfiction, and all of that, just as a quick capstone, and kind of compare it to the quality of his novels. So where are we going to go next? So coming in at number 5 is All the Pretty Horses. And this is book number 1 of the Border Trilogy, and we've talked about the other 2 so far. And this one is awesome. I mean, this one features the only real love story of any McCarthy novel that has a semblance of not being weird. I mean, in context now that one could say McCarthy's writing about himself dating this younger girl and all that, I don't need to get into that. It feels real, though. It feels visceral. In Sutree, there's a relationship with a prostitute. In another, there's many relationships with prostitutes and underage women in some of the other novels, or with your sister and stuff. This one is a classic boy meets girl love story, but it doesn't suck up the entire thing. This novel is awesome, and it could, like I said, at this point, 1 through 5, I could make an argument right now that this could be number 1, that this is Cormac McCarthy's greatest novel. This is the novel that brought Cormac McCarthy onto the scene. This is what makes him famous. This novel is the only reason we know who he is. But, I mean, this one's just amazing, you guys. How McCarthy writes this inverted romance and layers it with family trauma, and all this stuff with John Grady Cole is absolutely amazing. His passages about horses and our human soul connection with horses, absolutely amazing. Him working at his best. McCarthy talking about this romantic world that's now been lost that these boys are seeking, absolutely unbelievable. The plot, even if it's somewhat fantastic, makes you feel like you are in Eden at times. There are these highs and lows and like, oh my God moments that are really stark in this novel. Like, you hit the highest peaks of like beauty and the highest peaks of like darkness and like, oh my God, in this novel, which is somewhat interesting for McCarthy because we don't really get that. In a lot of these novels we get like destruction and stuff, but we don't really move into like the light very much, and when it is, it's not there. But at points in this novel and at its apex, this novel is just pure beauty. And it's interesting to see McCarthy write about love. It's interesting to see, I mean, because he does it as you can imagine it, as good as anyone else in history. And it's him being sentimental. It's him opening up. It's him writing not just to men, or not just being this literary guy. This is the first novel where McCarthy said, I don't need to be this literary egotistical person, or I don't need to do this for the money. I mean, even though he was doing it for the money, but this is where he truly starts to shine as a human writer, in my opinion, as this accessible author that we get to see in the crossing cities of the plain, the passenger, and the road. It's a little bit there in Sutree and some of the other novels, but this is for sure McCarthy's most human novel. There is a bond between the boys, a bond between the group, a love story, and of course, as in every McCarthy novel, a tragedy embedded into All the Pretty Horses. I mean, just right at the start. So this novel is about this boy, and this is all spoilers within the first 5 or 10 pages, nothing tragic that changes anything. This story is about a boy whose family's had this family farm, but the mom has decided she doesn't want to run the ranch anymore and is going to sell it. But he wants to be a cowboy, right? He wants to live this life, and his mom has decided to just go live and be like an artist or something. And so she's selling this farm, and there's nothing that he can do. And so to reinforce this, like for instance, like on page 3 or 4 of the novel, you kind of learn about this situation, and then he sees this cow skull or this horse skull on the ground, and McCarthy transports us into like the Comanches and their lifestyle and this old ideal that, all these young men were romanticized. And that's where the heat of this novel is, that you get connected to these characters. You go on this journey. You see it within your own heart. You have these similar fascinations, whether that's maybe not to the Wild West, but to whatever. And McCarthy shows you what happens when you hold on to that stuff too much. And it's an absolute barn burner, you guys. This one is a great novel. It is probably the best story of any McCarthy novel. But like I said, there are some higher ideals, for instance, in the Border Trilogy, some more soul level things that don't happen in this one. And that's partially because the crossing is 50,000 words more. That's an entire book, or novella, one could say, more of just content to work through. And the content that it does work through, in my opinion, is McCarthy really just kind of flexing his knowledge and showing like the more philosophical side of his fiction off, which, like I said, you can like that or not like that. I personally like that because I bring a lot away from that. I can really, because that's what makes fiction so awesome. Something that I've been thinking about lately is that a lot of, David Foster Wallace had this essay in a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again called E Inubis Plurum or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But it talks about how postmodernist fiction influenced television, and television basically stole a ton from postmodernist fiction to become highly effective. And we could say the same thing about the internet. But when we look at how like movies have ate literature alive and like basically taken a ton of it. I mean, we look at adapted screenplays and all the other ideas that they explore. It's all from literature. You can even look at how literature has inspired music and so many other things. It's interesting because novels haven't taken as much from music, the visual arts, or film, obviously, but what it has taken from is philosophy. What, for instance, a good film can do is take a book or a TV show and adapt it and make it visceral, like make it alive. Like, maybe it's not as good or whatever, it's not as deep, but it really brings it to life for the reader. And that's what good novels can do for philosophy, We could be talking about Nietzsche or Kant or Spinoza or something in their philosophies, but Cormac McCarthy can make those philosophies feel alive in a novel. And so when he does that, I'm very impressed because it never really feels like you're preaching to him. He weaves it into the web and the vibe of the novel and to this kind of larger point about what the character is going through. And so that's advanced level stuff there. And so I absolutely love that from McCarthy. And so that's why this one's ranked lower than The Crossing, in my opinion. And the other four is that it doesn't really get into that zone as much, but it's really heavy on the narrative and beauty side, which I love. And so now let's move to novel number 4 on my list, which is going to probably shake some things up, which is The Passenger and Stella Maris by McCarthy. And we're just going to combine them into one novel. People say that it was a cash grab to release, them one after another, but I also don't know if they could have been released within one text. They are separate, but they are the same all at the same time. And so we'll just talk about them as one entity because in combination, they are actually McCarthy's second longest work, a little bit shorter than Sutree and a little bit longer than The Crossing. And I feel like these works are an absolute masterpiece. And so there's a problem though with these works. The first 100 to 150 pages are troublesome. This novel follows Alicia and Bobby Western, this brother and sister who are mathematics prodigies, especially the sister Alicia. And The Passenger has this dual format where on one side, we are in the past with Alicia, who is having these hallucinations, and she's talking to these hallucinations and kind of going through this experience. Then on the other side, we have Bobby Western in the future. And so the hallucinations, especially at the start of the novel, can have some meandering and hard to read sections where he's putting on these performances. And now that I've read this, I think 4 times now, it's not that hard. But when I open this novel up, I got this on launch day. I actually read this. I got a VPN and got a copy from New Zealand the day before it came out in America and read it. But I was, you're expecting something more, right? It's Cormac McCarthy, especially with the run of the Border trilogy, the No Country for Old Men, The Road. You're expecting something up that alley. Then this novel, though, is really a product of McCarthy's peak. This is McCarthy. McCarthy had a draft of this done in 1980 that is pretty similar to what we have today. It made some evolutions and some of the scientific stuff along the way. But this novel was basically done in McCarthy's peak. And so when people say it's not as good, first of all, I think they had this high expectation. And I know so many people that stopped. They read the first 150 pages and got this sourpuss taste in their mouth and didn't go beyond that. But the last 200 pages or 300 pages of this novel, however much that is, and one can say if you add in Stella Maris to it, is McCarthy writing at his best. I mean, honestly, the scenes where Bobby Western is in Idaho and in the West and back in Tennessee is McCarthy basically writing nostalgically about all these places as him basically himself in this more autobiographical form in the modern world. And we never see that in any other McCarthy novel. No Country for Old Men is this El Paso Borderlands novel, but Cormac McCarthy sees himself at some level through Bobby Western, the protagonist. And as he's going through these places, I could tell, because I've been to a lot of these places, McCarthy's writing about personal travel experience. And once again, tying back to some of the earlier stuff, viewing himself as his dyad, as this bad guy who's done bad things like fucking his sister, and then also the scientific, logical mind, and the wanderer. It's all these different parts of McCarthy coming out on the page. And so there are other problems with this novel and these novels. They reference a ton of scientific stuff. They reference JFK and wars, but they reference a ton of scientific stuff that people have no idea what it means. And I have researched it all now and know what it all means. And so once again, this one kind of lends itself to research and rereading. But what's interesting is that one of the reasons that this novel is criticized is that the logic bros have come out and said that this isn't realistic, that the science, I have a friend, Golson, who isn't a logic bro, who's actually a really good reader, and he likes this novel. But he mentioned that he's a psychiatrist, and he mentioned that the psychiatry scenes with Alicia Western and the psychiatrist were unrealistic. And so there's some stuff, some math, some science stuff that isn't exactly right in this, or a little bit fantastical. But that's because this is the world of literature. Everybody, what is realistic? I mean, that's what we get to do here. We don't have it's in service of something larger. And so The Passenger is about spirituality. It is basically McCarthy's commentary on God, his conception of it, his conception of spirituality. And behind a couple layers through the rereading, I have learned that like Alicia, the main character in this, is a math witch, and all the thriller angles, all the things that people think lead to dead ends actually don't, but it requires you to kind of get into the theory of it. And so for me, now that I've understood this and talked to many different people who've studied this novel and studied it myself, I have a much higher conception of it. I see it as McCarthy's most tragic and nostalgic novel, and something that's him really exploring some of the deeper themes of life. And so that's where my head is at on this one. But I also understand there's this whole group of people who were primed to think that they were getting another Blood Meridian or this crazy novel, and who were turned off by the hallucination scenes, by the science stuff, and also people who don't know how to bridge that spiritual gap, who don't know how to study vibes and study general nature and not have to get into the weeds of what does he mean by the science, but what is he generally saying about the science, then connecting that back to the characters. And when you do, you see that McCarthy's making a deeper commentary on evil than he does in many of his other novels. He's making a deeper commentary on love than many of his other novels, on our relationship to the modern technological world and than any other novels, and God and many of these other things. He's really making a commentary on all of that, and it's just about the reader being able to bridge that gap and be willing to understand that, be willing to make that jump, not have to be told everything. And being told a lot of information and being able to sit with it and not say this is right or wrong, but trying to put it into this larger tapestry. And I think that when you do that, this is a top tier novel by McCarthy. I can't see how anyone could compare this to Child of God or, Cities of the Plain or, The Outer Dark or something like that. This is so much more expansive. And once again, it may not be your type of novel, but that's not what this ranking video is about. It's about really kind of examining what really matters in a novel. And we all have different kind of categories, but kind of balancing those with the general literary mind and appeal and like where the canon's heading and what's been done before, and saying, okay, like this is it. Because like if this video was about my personal preferences and what I would like to read, like what I enjoyed reading the most, this list would look a lot different. Like I enjoy reading like the Border trilogy and probably Blood Meridian the most if I just wanted to have one book to enjoy myself with. But I can't not see. I don't think like I haven't seen anyone who says like they're like this novel isn't good or it's like not McCarthy and there aren't strokes of genius in here, and like I haven't been able to take any of them seriously. And it is crazy because a lot of people just read. They are readers. They aren't integrating this information and letting it transform them and make them better people. They are just gluttons for information. And so those are the type of people though who are reviewing books a lot of the time in these magazines, or like, dissecting all this stuff at like too deep of a level and not actually trying to figure out. So that's what I figured out. Like with all the plain stuff, all the stuff that's in this novel, there's literally answers, or at least a spectrum of theories that we can look at that aren't just random or this is incomplete. McCarthy didn't have time to finish this. This was complete in 1980. I haven't got a chance to read that draft, but I've known people who've been to the archive since it came out, like 2 years ago or whatever, and who have read it. And what they've told me is that this was all intact. And so it's really that you don't understand it, and that McCarthy, this is in league with the Blood Meridians, the Sutrees, and all of that. And so, boom, there it is, everyone. I would recommend this one. I don't know in your journey where you would want to read this one. This one really is going to push you if you are a lazier reader, if you really can't, get caught, if you need pure narrative at all times and don't like loops that are still open and require you to kind of figure them out. or just research it, like, read through it, and then you can go. I have plenty of videos on it. Other people have talked about this stuff. It's pretty widespread by now, like some of the stuff McCarthy was doing. And when you see that, it's like, wow, this is something that is very ambitious that a lot of other novels haven't done. So cool. There that one is. So here we are, the final moment. My top ranked McCarthy novel, the best McCarthy novel, is, of course, there's only one left on the list now. And that, of course, is Sutree. This is the McCarthy's best novel by far. This is probably the greatest piece of Southern literature ever written. And yes, you heard that here first. Better than Flannery O'Connor, better than William Faulkner. This is it. I would say that Faulkner's entire bibliography is much better than McCarthy. And if we were doing like a top 10 between each other, he would have more even in the top 5. This is an absolute masterpiece. This is an existentialist novel. This is a spiritual novel. This is a Christian novel. This is a novel about the soul. This is a novel about modern life. This is a novel about alcoholism. This is a novel about parental abuse. This is a novel about loss and love and the detachments from emotions and how you get stuck in your hometown. This is a novel just about everything. And coming in at 176,000 words, you have the ability to do that. This is McCarthy's longest novel. This is the novel that McCarthy worked on for 20 years. That's autobiographical and covers everything in this entire story that I've talked about. It can at times be loose on its narrative. It can at times not be a linear A to B journey. But there are times in this where the story does pick up. And it's as good of a narrative as McCarthy has ever done. The dream scenes, the italicized stuff in this novel is as good as anything McCarthy has ever done. The characterization and the false messianic trope that McCarthy loves to play is as good as anything McCarthy has ever done. The descriptions of nature is better than anything McCarthy has ever done. McCarthy interplaying with his own soul and his own beliefs is better than anything he has done. McCarthy encoding spiritual systems is as good as anything he's ever done. Basically, if I look at the entire list of these standards that I'm holding, Sutree checks off every single one, leaves none behind, and excels and actually wins at all of them. If we wanted to do like a top choice ranking and like take all these categories and rank all the books, like Sutree on that spectrum would win that easily, especially for like the serious reader. Is this an easy book to read? No. Is this a classic narrative? Absolutely not, everyone. Sutree is about Cornelius Sutree, which is Cormac McCarthy, this man who was born into a wealthy family like McCarthy and has rejected that lifestyle to be a fisherman. He is hanging around with this cast of characters in downtown Knoxville who are just drinking, going to jail. It's an absolute mess. Sutree is falling in love with people he shouldn't be with, underage girls. They're like 12, 13. He's falling in love with prostitutes. He's falling in love with all these things. All this stuff is happening. He's dealing with his family trauma and the fallout from his family. He's dealing with his own faith. He's having this existential crisis. He's trying to evolve. He's in the moment. He's spiritual. There's all these things happening and it's visceral. It's there. The cast of characters, the side quests, all of that is there, plus more. It is one of McCarthy's most human novels. Speaking of another standard, it is human. We confront all these characters that you may think are weird or something. And now that like our media is so polarizing, like anyone that isn't like just like normal is suddenly a weirdo. But McCarthy humanizes so many people. He humanizes Sutree without interiority. He humanizes idiots. Like, it's crazy. This is McCarthy's masterpiece. Like I said, this may not be your cup of tea, but there isn't a novel that McCarthy worked harder on, put more into, and layered deeper than this one. I get it. Blood Meridian is about cowboys. Judge Holden gives big speeches. I know. Like I said, I would rather read Blood Meridian than Sutree if I was going to just want to have a fun time or even a philosophical time. But this is a very complex novel. This is a novel that will continue to give and is, I'll say it here, probably the best, great American novel. I can't imagine. What else? East of Eden? You want to compare East of Eden to this? You want to compare As I Lay Dying to this? You want to compare Huck Finn to this? I think that Moby Dick holds its own weight. I feel like Moby Dick is, definitely, I could definitely see someone saying that this is objectively better, but McCarthy has the gift of modernity on his side and of postmodernism and of innovation. He has all these different tricks up his sleeve that Melville didn't have. So in terms of like what Melville did in the time that he did it in is much more innovative and much more grand than what McCarthy did. But if we handed these two books to somebody and they knew nothing about it, but they were a smart, integrated individual who let's just say like loved literature, just had never heard of Moby Dick before or Sutree or knew what was happening in them, they would say Sutree is the better novel a lot of the time. Lonesome Dove, Catch-22, To Kill a Mockingbird, Little Women, like they can't compare to this novel about the death. This novel is about the crisis we all face within our own soul. This fracturing of modern consciousness between the artists. In the original drafts of Sutree, he called Sutree the poet within us, the artist within us, the degradation, the loser within us, and then the person who's trying to escape from the past, and then the person who's trying to be better. That is the story of our life, everybody. Even if you did everything right, you took your honors classes, you took your AP class, you got your computer science degree, and you did everything correctly, that is the crisis that you just ignored. And it's still within you, and you just found ways to cope with it or like work around it. But it is modernity. It is everything. Especially as men, if you are actually integrated, if you are actually trying, if you're actually attuned and not just fucking, totally just blind to all of it. That's what this novel is. It's really good. Like I said, we can have a conversation about the great American novel, Against the Day, Underworld, we could get in conversation, but this one is in that. If there's one book to, like I said, a smart reader to show off what McCarthy can do, it is this. He doesn't need a Judge Holden to carry the philosophical weight. He doesn't need anybody. Whoever the fuck is narrating this story is wild. In terms of narration, in terms of depth, the narrator of this one is, how McCarthy frames it, is much crazier than anybody else. And so this is by and large his masterpiece. This is McCarthy's greatest work. Like I said, we can argue all day, we can shuffle it, but I think a lot of people don't like this one, kind of like The Passenger, because it's not easy to read. It's long. There are meandering sections that don't make sense. He wanted it to be longer. He wanted it to be like 200,000 plus words, but it's to this greater vision. It's to what McCarthy went through about breaking out of his home, about everything that we try to do to break past this old world, these old ties, these old connections, and we don't. Like I said, what's more important than that? Some epic stuff about God, all this? No, that's what creates values. That's what all of us have to overcome. That is the demon. That's this ghost and skeleton in the closet for all of us. And McCarthy being able to write through that and write about his own soul and him letting it all go after he did, this novel was at a standstill for a really long time. It wasn't, McCarthy was working on it and he kept thinking it was going to be his next novel, but it wasn't until he left Knoxville and left his second wife and had 4 years in El Paso to work on this outside of his hometown, in this new life, taking mescaline, getting with these underage girls, all this insanity. But that expansiveness, that unruliness really helped him drive this. And if you look at like the drafts and what he was able to accomplish once he left, it took a quantum leap. And that's what it was. And that was the quantum leap that led to things like Blood Meridian and all these things that we talk about. That's the quantum leap that led to him writing No Country for Old Men, The Cities of the Plain screenplay, and so much more. Maybe The Passenger, some of the unpublished stuff that we'll probably get in the future. Like, it was in that zone where McCarthy in his 40s hit that infinite level, hit that his peak as a writer. And so there it is, everyone. I mean, this is the one. And so let us now move on to some other selections. Let's move on to the screenplays, and some of his other stuff, just the random assortment of things. So next on our list, and it's called A Novel in Dramatic Form, is The Sunset Limited by McCarthy. And it was turned into a great movie on HBO. I'd recommend reading it and then watching it. This is an awesome contemplation by McCarthy on God, on life, on reality in a modern context. It's for sure short, coming in at only 18,000 words, so not a lot going on. But this is McCarthy's best screenplay or shorter work by far, because what we're going to talk about next is, well, and I should say really fast, I would say that this could contend with, this could try to break into tier 2, but I feel like it would be at the top of tier 3. I feel like with at the time it was written to, that it's, it's on par with The Road, and I wouldn't say it's like a lesser work. This one's for sure not a lesser work than some of his other novels, but I don't think it breaks into that second tier that I've been kind of talking about. So next we have Whales and Men, which is an unpublished screenplay by McCarthy that he actually worked on after he finished Blood Meridian. So between Blood Meridian and All the Pretty Horses, McCarthy was trying to make some money and, get back into the screenplay game. And he wrote this weird screenplay called Whales and Men about these whale, I don't even know what they're like, marine biologists, and they're like trying to save these whales, but then it like leads into these crazy ruminations and philosophical inquiries into like the nature of God and language. And it's, in terms of direct analysis of language, Whales and Men has more of that than any McCarthy novel. In terms of analysis of like McCarthy talking about God and stuff in a very direct way, like basically from his own point of view, this is the novel. it's hard to read though. Like it's unfinished. Like it's not very good. The story isn't very good either. It's all right, but it's kind of like you read through it and like I've read it in full once, but then I've scanned it a couple other times just looking for like cool quotes and stuff. And so that's what this one kind of is. I've made a lot of my videos like Cormac McCarthy on the unconscious pull quotes from this, like a lot of the really cool stuff where McCarthy talks about like the dark nature of God at length for, a couple hundred words or something, and it's not hidden in a character, it's in this book. And so yeah, you can check this out, or just like check out anything on my, as you work through my channel, you will get a lot of quotes from Whales and Men. Interesting, but definitely basically at the bottom of the pack because of that. This is for people who are really just, you've been perplexed by McCarthy's vision of the world and you just want a little bit more. And it's really just more Gnostic stuff, more just about, God not caring and the darkness and whales evolving to be in contact with God and the unconscious, though. Just a lot of stuff like that. So next up, we have the screenplay, The Gardener's Son. If you guys want to watch The Gardener's Son movie, it is on this channel. So you just have to type in Right Conscious, The Gardener's Son. Really good. It's a pretty good movie. I mean, it's an old movie. It's an old TV movie, but it's really dark. I mean, if you read it or watch it, it's a really dark screenplay. I mean, I have a video on the Cormac McCarthy course about the Gnosticism within it. Like, it's definitely a weird novel. Actually, Cormac McCarthy has a cameo in it. And here's me 2 years ago with the green screen. Right here on the left side. So there's McCarthy right there, but a better shot of him is him here shaking his hand right here. I mean, it's super low quality, but yeah. So anyway, it's kind of cool. The setup's gotten so much better. Holy crap. Just kind of it's a dark screenplay though. It's very similar almost. It feels like Child of God almost. If you like Child of God, I think that you'd like The Gardener's Son. It has a little bit more philosophical inquiries into it all, and more like it has actually like racial tension and stuff and like other things involved. It's very Faulknerian, one could say. And so The Gardener's Son is really good, but I would put it tier 3. I would say that it's, in terms of priority, that it's definitely not as good as any of the novels. I would say that it's better than The Stonemason, which was written by McCarthy in the late 1980s. So this was another one that was written after Blood Meridian about a Southern black family and some of the kind of the drama and inner workings within it. And this has never been turned into a movie. Probably will never be. I mean, maybe in the future when like Hollywood's really dead and they're just trying to get anything. This one just, to me, feels a little bit incomplete. Like it's a little bit of an odd play. I mean, it does have a lot. I mean, it is spiritual. It does kind of meander around some of these ideas, but it doesn't hit the notes very strong on that end as much as I want it to. And then the story element isn't as strong either. It's definitely an interesting experiment though in McCarthy's canon. And so I wouldn't read this one for a while. I mean, this one is, I think, at the bottom of the pile. So next we have The Counselor screenplay, which was also turned into a movie with like a super star-studded cast. The movie was a little bit odd. I mean, I actually liked the movie. I mean, people like hated it. I didn't think it was terrible. I really like the screenplay though. Like I said, I feel like this is if you've read all the Westerns, this is actually the best capstone to it all. It basically kind of brings in most of the ideas that McCarthy talks about throughout all of that into a modern context with some modern jokes, and also on a more like personal level with like these ideas of greed and like all of this stuff. And so it's really good in my opinion. So Cormac McCarthy has one published poem in his high school newspaper that's actually really good. It's like a Chinese style wilderness poem that I really like. McCarthy published the Kekule, I don't even remember how to say it right now. That's not how you say it. Problem, a nonfiction piece on the nature of the unconscious, then answered some more questions on it. I feel like that one was okay. I mean, it's very McCarthy. It's very just like, it's a process. It's like, I think him working through this artist thing that like David Lynch had to do when you're an artist. Everyone's always asking you, where's all this stuff come from? And he just kind of came up with the unconscious is this ancient system of problem solving, which is true. But I think that's a little logic broy as an answer in the long run. I mean, I know he didn't like Carl Jung and stuff. I have a video on this channel why Cormac McCarthy hated Carl Jung or something like that. That's pretty good in my opinion. And then last but not least, he has two stories, A Drowning Incident and A Wake for Susan, which he released before The Orchard Keeper. And the only reason you would read those, and they're all right, just on standalone pieces, is that many of the themes that he talks about in like A Drowning Incident find their way into Outer Dark and like the drowning of the puppies and Blood Meridian. A Wake for Susan is actually, he steals a lot of that and puts that in The Orchard Keeper. And so that's like, you can just kind of learn some of the tricks and some of the things he was working on and see how he applies it into some of his later work. And so those aren't anything spectacular either. So there it is, everyone. A full ranking of every Cormac McCarthy piece of literature that has been released. I mean, the interviews that he did throughout his life. I have an unreleased Cormac McCarthy interview on my channel. It's only available at the archive, but I got it transcribed and posted it over on my Substack if you guys want to check that out. In terms of the video interviews, the one with Krakauer at the Santa Fe Institute was obviously pretty good. Like, we really got to see McCarthy talk. And the problem with, a lot of people don't like the Lawrence Krauss interview. And Lawrence Krauss is definitely annoying, like Jesus Christ. But he released in a later piece that they did that after hanging out at lunch where they had chimichangas and margaritas. And they had already talked for 3 or 4 hours. And McCarthy was like in his late 80s. And then they had that conversation and he was tired. And I've interviewed people before on this channel. And I've done a couple dozen interviews now. And it's really hard when someone doesn't respond to you, or it's like they're tired, or it's kind of hard. And what it ends up being is that if you're doing an hour, that means you're leading. That means you have to just rant basically to fill the time. And so McCarthy, I think by that age, he looks really bad. He died a couple months later. And yeah. I think that was kind of the end of the road for him. He had gone through cancer at that point. Now we know that he beat cancer and all this stuff. And so between that Krakauer interview and then he went through cancer treatment and all this stuff. And so I think that he just didn't have that oomph. And so that interview isn't as good, but they actually talk about some of the quotes from the novel. And we get McCarthy saying it's my character saying that, not me, which is so funny, which I'm sure he's had to do a lot in his life. Guys run up to him bro, I love that shit that happened that you said. And so even though McCarthy is gone, we can continue his legacy. We can continue the literary renaissance. We can continue to put out great works that transform people and make them go deeper into literature, reignite their love in literature, make them contemplate fatherhood and so many other things, life, all this stuff. We can also be better people than Cormac McCarthy. I'm not here to judge on this channel. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter to me. I don't separate the art from the artist. I think that's dumb when people say they do that. It's actually impossible. I bring it all together and then it is what it is. These aren't people I know. These aren't people that I have to deal with on a daily basis. They have no effect on me. I don't need to appease them. People will say in the comments David Foster Wallace wouldn't have liked you. Dude, this YouTuber, this influencer, this writer, he would hated your writing. Yeah, dude, I wouldn't want to be friends with David Foster Wallace either, bro. If there was a guy like David Foster Wallace as my neighbor, I want to be friends with him. Same with Cormac McCarthy. If it was this high-level artist, yeah, I'd like to talk to them about their art and stuff. But we can do this, you guys. That's the goal of all of this. To share the ideas, share the thoughts, not worry about those things, and continue to be better. And so that is my final message. If you guys want to support me and the literary renaissance, subscribe to my Substack. There's free content coming out all the time. Today I'm releasing a free 2-hour interview with John Pastelli on his book. It's free. The one of the best novels written in the last 5 years by far. Really good stuff. I'm trying to post free weekly interviews and free content all of the time. I'm relaunching my free writing school over on Substack. If you are a writer, I have helped hundreds of writers get dozens of readers, and dozens of writers get hundreds of readers in the past year on Substack for free. And I stopped that for a while, and now I'm relaunching this entire program, and sometime hopefully in November. That's going to be insane. So if you are a writer, you need to come over. Plus, if you want to support me, you are supporting people in the future. I have now gone full time. For the last 200 Cormac McCarthy videos I did, I was a high school English teacher. I built out my entire McCarthy course by waking up early before my wife did, and all this other stuff. Now, though, with your support, I can help wake up more people. As you just heard, I've helped thousands of writers get into the game and get online and get motivated. That number is going to hopefully be in the millions at some point. And so by supporting me, you are supporting everyone else who I affect in the future also. And so each membership means a lot to me. If not, just like the video, comment, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm right, put your ranking down there. I would love to hear it all. I would love to see it all. And I will see each and every one of you guys in my next video.